The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by XChair, the XChair chair, office chair. XChairTom.com is the website, XChairTHOM.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeets.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. For our book club today, we're reading from The Healing Power of Neurofeedback, the revolutionary lens technique for restoring optimal brain function. The author is Stephen Larson, PhD, and the foreword is by a guy named Thom Hartmann. This is from Stephen Larson's introduction. As the distinguished American psychologist Jerome Bruner has said, not until we have begun to tell a story about our own experience does it make sense to others as well, to ourselves as well as to others. This book is the story of my experiences with neurofeedback, an emerging technology of healing in which EEG, electroencephalography, processors and computers team up with the brain's own circuits to accomplish remarkable forms of self-regulation. It's also the story of the development and evolution of a particular kind of neurofeedback known as LENS, low-energy neurofeedback system, which emerged from the work and research of a dedicated psychologist with an affinity for electronics and an intuitive understanding of the energies of the body, Dr. Len Oakes. But most of what is presented here are stories relating the actual living experiences of men and women struggling with disorders that affect their nervous systems, parents looking for help with their children afflicted with attention deficit or obsessive-compulsive disorder, people who are depressed or anxious and have run out of medication options, people with a head injury or the sudden onset of a degenerative disease that has left them cognitively impaired or emotionally unstable. These stories are in the area that the scientifically minded might refer to as qualitative research, clinical studies, or narrative histories. In this book, you will also find the stories of therapists who grow as they confront their own challenges in understanding, developing new healing paradigms, and learning how to help people who are very sensitive neurologically. Although we also cite and rely upon much hard evidence, scientific data, and measurement, and use refined high-tech equipment that measures the energy of the brain exquisitely, the real heart of what we have to say is about the personal hero journeys that transform the self and expand human therapeutic technologies. These stories move the heart as well as inform the mind. The discipline called neurofeedback or neurotherapy is itself a subdiscipline of biofeedback, a term broadly used for techniques of self-regulation. In biofeedback, a machine is used to generate electronic signals that inform a person about factors such as his or her hand temperature or muscle tension. Starting in the 1950s, it was discovered that, guided by such feedback, a person could learn to raise or lower blood pressure, quiet muscle spasms, or soothe an irritable bowel. Neurofeedback is simply the application of this same principle to the electrical waves produced by the brain as recorded on an EEG, an electroencephalograph. With subtlety and skill, it is helping thousands of children and adults learn to regulate their own nervous systems, a not insignificant matter, for the CNS, the central nervous system, determines just how one functions in life. The field of neurofeedback is not yet well known enough to have a reputation based on its remarkable efficacy, perhaps because its premises seem closer to the traditional wisdom and spiritual disciplines of the East than to the dominant Western scientific paradigm. But this dominant model is changing as millions of people instinctively and wisely aim themselves toward complementary and alternative medical approaches, and as disciplines broadly known as energy medicine reemerge into the public theater. Energy medicine had a fledgling career toward the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, but it was displaced by the monolithic and, it should be added, chauvinistic, allopathic approach that most of us have grown up with. Critics have pointed out that while Western medicine has indisputable benefits, especially in dealing with serious illnesses and health crises, it has very little to contribute when it comes to staying healthy and avoiding illness. Neurofeedback is a people's medicine that has emerged from the work of dedicated clinicians and their satisfied patients, and it is my belief that the work of Len Oakes will come to the forefront of neurofeedback, and that neurofeedback itself will take a significant place in the public awareness among those approaches that are not trying to displace Western medicine, but complement it. So people with conventional medical and scientific educations need not feel threatened by this method. I believe it does more than challenge our current paradigm. It expands it in a healthy direction. In fact, the work presented herein is entirely compatible with the scientific method and pragmatic empiricism. However, I will confess that this book was written by some strange kind of maverick wearing motley intellectual clothing, always sniffing down the trails of misery, more committed to journeys than to arriving anywhere. One part of me is a good modern thinker, a psychology professor and a social scientist, as grounded in a post-Newtonian universe as anyone else. The other part of me has always had a fancy for myth and magic, and my published writing includes both scholarly and popular books on shamanism, mythology, and some biographical works, including A Fire in the Mind, The Life of Joseph Campbell. While researching Campbell's biography, I found that he also considered himself a maverick. I discovered that we are alike in another way. We both believed invisible things play an all-important part in shaping human behavior. For Campbell, it was myths, as he called them, of the immemorial imagination. But my professional focus has always been on consciousness and energy. Healing Power of Neurofeedback by Steve Larson.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you, the place where smart people get their news. The taking of millennial wealth by rich white boomers. You know, there's a lot in the news today, and, you know, they just had the primaries yesterday. California came out okay, the Democrats. Joe Siegelman, Don Siegelman's son, won the primary to be the Democratic candidate for Attorney General in Alabama. Great guy, check out his website, check out what he's doing. I've met Joe Siegelman. I had dinner with him. Louise and I had dinner with him and his sister. And really smart guy and a really smart lawyer, and he'll make a great attorney general. But I think the stuff that, and I'm going to get into some of the very specific news of the day, like this new veterans bill, as part of my rant for this first hour. And our second hour, by the way, we're going to be talking about the 50th anniversary of the death of Robert F. Kennedy with Lamar Waldron. And, so we will be going through that. And in our third hour, Mike Lux is going to drop by. And throughout, we'll take your calls, and I'll be talking about other pieces of the news. But I think so much of what is happening right now in the United States, from the Republican Party using, race baiting and phony patriotism. You saw Trump's thing yesterday where he's like, we don't want the Eagles here. Most of their players are black and they don't like me. And so, we're just going to have a whole bunch of white people in suits. It was like the Brooks Brothers riot down in Florida when Tom DeLay sent his staff members down to pound on the windows where they were recounting the votes in the 2000 election and shouting, "Stop the vote," pretending they were Floridians. And they ultimately got the Supreme Court to stop the vote count. The vote count. But, they called it the Brooks Brothers riot because these guys were all dressed in $1,000 suits, right? They all worked for Tom DeLay. Well, it was the same thing yesterday. I didn't watch the whole thing. I did see pictures of it. I didn't see a single black face among pretty much anywhere. And there were a number of people who were tweeting that they went around and asked people as they were leaving, who's your favorite Eagles player? And none of them could answer. These weren't Eagles fans. These were props. They were probably Republican staffers from Capitol Hill. Although, who knows? Maybe Trump donors who came in to have a nice afternoon on the south lawn of the White House. It's just, it's a scam. It's a hustle. And he's using, as Samuel Johnson said back in the 1700s, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. And they are using the American flag, patriotism, the national anthem, which apparently Donald Trump doesn't know the words to. They're using that because he kept, kind of mumbling while he was trying to sing yesterday, or America the Beautiful, or whatever it was. They're using this to tear us apart. Now, why would they do that? They're doing that because there is an enormous amount of money at stake. See, power usually comes down to money. Money usually comes down to power, because with power you can acquire money. With money you can acquire power, and you can keep your money. And that's what's going on. Paul Buchheit wrote a piece. It's up at the top of Common Dreams right now. It's titled "The Taking of Millennial Wealth by Rich White Boomers." And, I want to go through some of this, but we're also going to talk about Bain Capital and Toys R Us, because it's a piece of the exact same story. And we're going to talk about the Veterans Administration bill that the Republicans are pushing, that the White House is saying, please don't pay for, unless you take that money away from things like Medicaid, Medicare, programs that help other people, pitting our veterans against everybody else. So let me just go through this stuff, because I think this is really what's going on. This is the stuff this is why they are willing, why Republicans, broadly speaking, funded by right-wing billionaires who care only about their money and not about their country. This is why these guys are doing it, and this is what the consequence is. It's all about stealing money from the middle class, the working class, and the entire millennial generation, with the exception of the top 10%, the bottom 90% of the millennial generation. It's about taking their money and handing it off to the uber rich. It isn't boomers who stole the millennial money. In fact, most of the guys who are making these decisions, people like, Charles and David Koch, they're my dad's generation. They're the greatest generation. They're not even the boomers. But, some of the hustlers, and certainly a lot of the guys working on Wall Street, are boomers. But it's not the boomer generation that's ripping off the millennials. It is a small, relatively small group, probably fewer than 100,000 people. And at the core, the political and power core of it, probably fewer than 5,000 people, who are fabulously rich, who are absolutely obsessively committed to getting richer. And they don't give a damn. They don't give a rat's ass about who is affected by it, as long as they get richer. So as Paul Buchheit points out, the richest 10% of Americans in the last decade have taken 85% of the new wealth. In the past 8 years, if you are in the 1% of Americans, on average, now keep in mind, you know, the top 1% goes all the way up to the top 100th of 1%, the people who are billionaires. At the bottom end of the top 1%, I think you've got to earn around $500,000 or $600,000 a year to be in the top 1%, but it's also wealth. But the top 1%, on average, if you're in the top 1% in the last 8 years, you have an extra $6.7 million in your checking account or your investments. The top 1%, on average, made an additional $6.75 million. The top 10%, excluding the top 1%, so that's the 2% to 10%, the top 10%. If you're in the top 10%, in the last 8 years, you have averaged in your savings account, or your 401k, or whatever it is, around $700,000 of money that you didn't have 8 years ago. So that's the top 10%. If you're in the bottom 50%, you lost $3,000 in the last 8 years. You're behind where you started out. And by the way, that bottom 50% includes most of the indebted millennials. And the millennials saw their average net worth drop, not by the $3,000 average of everybody in the bottom 50%, but they saw their net worth drop far more substantially, by about $8,000. So if you are a millennial, if you're one of the older millennials, you're up to 32 years old, you're a millennial. So if you're a millennial who's been in the workforce for the last 8 years, you are $8,000 behind where you started, if you're in the bottom 50% of millennials. The wages of America's poorest 50% have been stagnant for 40 years. This is intentional. Right now, young adults who graduate college with student debt have a median net worth of a negative $1,900. Millennials are better educated now than any generation in the history of the United States, and yet they earn 20% less money than baby boomers did at the same age with less education just 30 or 40 years ago. Why? Well, because so-called full employment now, back in the day, it included, at least some simple benefits and reasonable pay. Keep in mind, the 1968 minimum wage, if you were to inflation adjust it, right now would be $22 an hour. So people had a decent standard of living, even at the minimum wage in 1968. But now you got the gig economy that typically pays less than half the wages. A full-time gig job pays less than half the wages of a regular full-time job, on average. 2/3 of millennials, 21 to 32 years old, 2/3 of millennials have absolutely nothing saved for retirement. There are more 25 to 29-year-olds living with their parents or grandparents today than at any time since 1933, since the Great Depression. Stephen Brill, he's an author, he writes about how this happened. And this is what I want to get into next, is how they ripped us off. He says, ingenious financial and legal engineering turned our economy from an engine of long-term growth and shared prosperity into a casino with only a few big winners. They created exotic and risky financial instruments that separated those taking the risk from those who would bear the consequences. The result is a new, divided America. And I want to get into exactly how this happened. the changes in the law that Reagan made and the Republicans made in the 1980s that allowed for things like Bain Capital to come into existence, and the kind of damage that these new exotic financial instruments that Stephen Brill was talking about have done to America, to make people like Mitt Romney billionaires and make the rest of us paupers. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We got some just amazing information. Just stick around. We'll be right back. And welcome back. I got a, well, actually, I want to do that a little later. Jim Carrey has put together a meme that has been circulating, and it's pretty profound. I mean, Jim Carrey has become a really great political activist. And his meme is pretty straightforward. He says, the worst terror a child can experience is being taken from their parents. I remember when Louise and I were young parents. We were, in our 20s, and one of our kids was old enough to go shopping on his own, right? He was 7 or 8, and he wanted to go into the store and buy something all by himself. And so Louise and I sat in the car out in front of the store while he went into the store, and then he was going to come back out. He went in with his dollar, and he was going to buy whatever he was going to buy and come out and be very proud of himself. And I don't recall exactly what happened. I think it was a security guard came along or something, but we couldn't leave our car parked right in front of it was a strip mall, right? Right in front of that store door entrance. So we looped around and parked in the parking lot, found a parking space, a couple cars in where we could see the door, we could see, when our kid came out. When he came out, though, our car wasn't where he expected, and he freaked. Little 7-year-old, suddenly terrified. Where'd mom and dad go? I mean, freaked. That is the perfectly normal, healthy, appropriate response of a child to the loss of their parents. Now, we were able to pull out of the parking spot and honk the horn, and he saw us, and all was good. And, I don't think he was permanently scarred by it. But I still remember it vividly for the intensity of that response. In fact, I have no recollection throughout my childhood of any time when I felt that my parents were being either taken from me or had abandoned me. I know some people have, had really difficult childhoods. I'm very fortunate. I didn't. And my parents were always there for me. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, so it made it a lot easier. But I don't even remember the 30 seconds to a minute that one of my kids experienced, coming out of that store. I don't remember that at any point in my life. Can you imagine the terror of being a little child and being taken away from your mother and then being put in a cage? Particularly in a cage with other kids. Kids can be insanely cruel. I mean, I said I had a pretty idyllic childhood. The worst part of it, frankly, was the other kids. I was the skinny geek who didn't know how to play sports and who would rather sit under a tree and read a book than play baseball. And I was always the last one picked for every team. So I was the one who got beat up a lot, right? Kids can be cruel. And Trump now is throwing these kids in together, 3-year-olds with 10-year-olds and 16-year-olds. I guarantee you, this is evil. Jim Carrey says the worst terror a child can experience is being taken from their parents. Would blonde, blue-eyed children ever be treated so brutally at our border? Would 4,600 Puerto Ricans have been left to die if they were white? No. Trumpism is racism. What in God's name have we become? Amen, Jim Carrey. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. XChairTom.com is the website, XChairTHOM.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeats.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Quip, Q-U-I-P, at getquip.com/Tom. Okay, how we're getting ripped off. Now, I just went through, basically how badly we've been ripped off. But who are the rip-off-ers? We are the rip-off-ees. Who are the rip-off-ers, and how are they pulling this off? David Dayen has a great piece in The Nation magazine, thenation.com. It was published yesterday. And it's titled, Toys R Us Workers Take on Private Equity Barons and Say You Ought to Be Ashamed. And here's what happened. Toys R Us was a profitable company. The spin that Republicans and hucksters and banksters and shill artists for the uber rich are trying to put out there right now is that the reason Toys R Us went bankrupt is because Amazon ate their lunch. That is absolutely, simply, totally not true. Toys R Us, actually, 1 out of every 5 toys in America last year was sold by Toys R Us. They had $11 billion in revenue last year, and every year for the last 3 years, they have grown. They're not shrinking. They're not being damaged by Amazon. Toys R Us was doing just fine, thank you very much. But during the Reagan administration, they legalized something that prior to that had been illegal. And it created the whole, the Michael Milkens of the world, the first generation of what they called at the time M&A artists, mergers and acquisition artists, which then led to venture capitalism, then to vulture capitalism, and now they renamed it private equity to make it sound nice. The stuff that Mitt Romney does for a living. And the way it works is they go to a company that's doing well, like Toys R Us, and they say, hey, nice company you got there. We're going to buy you. And Bain Capital, along with 2 other companies who played a smaller role, I think it was KKR and, hang on just a second, I got it. Yeah, Bain and KKR. There was one other company that was and Vornado Realty Trust. They played a very small role in this. So these 3 companies went to them, and they said, we're going to buy your company. And the cost to buy this company with $11 billion in revenue, the cost to buy this company was $5.3 billion. That's how much money it would take to buy Toys R Us. So they borrowed $5.3 billion, kicked in $1.3 billion of their own money. I guess the total was actually $6.6 billion. So they borrowed $5.3 billion to buy Toys R Us. And then they said to Toys R Us, we borrowed that money in your name because we now own the company. So we don't owe the $5 billion. You do, Toys R Us. And you have to pay the banks back that $5.3 billion. And we continue to be able to siphon all the profits out of the company and put it in our pockets. Plus we get management fees. Plus we get consulting fees. We get all this money. And you pay the debt, Toys R Us. And so Toys R Us was making $500 million annual debt service payments. They were paying $500 million a year on debt that they didn't have before Bain came along, before Mitt Romney came along. They had none of this debt. And then Romney's company comes in and, well, I don't know that they had no debt, but they, this is brand new debt. And then Romney's company comes in and takes this. And what happens is that even with $11 billion in revenue, you can't handle, I mean, that's total revenue. The toy business is a fairly low margin business. There wasn't enough profit left over to pay it. And so now you have the situation where all 735 Toys R Us stores are going to close at the end of this month. 33,000 workers are losing their jobs. Are they getting compensated? Are they getting severance? No, the executives all got their severance. They all got their multi-million-dollar packages the day before or just before they declared bankruptcy. And of course, Bain got their money, or most of it.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
This is just one of the ways that these fascists are competing to own America. And I want to get into that in more detail right after this. Stick around. Today we're reading in Thom Hartmann University Book Club from How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, Time-Tested Methods for Conquering Worry by Dale Carnegie, perhaps an appropriate book in the era of Trump. This is from Chapter 2, a magic formula for solving worry situations. Would you like a quick, surefire recipe for handling worry situations? A technique you can start using right away before you go any further in reading this book? Then let me tell you about the method worked out by Willis H. Carrier, the brilliant engineer who launched the air conditioning industry and who headed the world-famous Carrier Corporation out of Syracuse, New York. It is one of the best techniques I've ever heard of for solving worry problems, and I got it from Mr. Carrier personally when we were having lunch together one day at the Engineers Club in New York. When I was a young man, Mr. Carrier said, I worked for the Buffalo Forge Company in Buffalo, New York. I was handed the assignment of installing a gas cleaning device in the plant of the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company at Crystal City, Missouri, a plant costing millions of dollars. The purpose of this installation was to remove the impurities from the gas so it could be burned without injuring the engines. This method of cleaning gas was new. It had been tried only once before and under different conditions. In my work at Crystal City, Missouri, unforeseen difficulties arose. It worked after a fashion, but not well enough to meet the guarantee we had made. I was stunned by my failure. It was almost as if someone had struck me a blow on the head. My stomach, my insides began to twist and turn. For a while, I was so worried I couldn't sleep. Finally, common sense reminded me that worry wasn't getting me anywhere. So I figured out a way to handle my problem without worrying. It worked superbly. I've been using the same anti-worry technique for more than 30 years. It is simple. Anyone can use it. It consists of 3 steps. Step 1. I analyzed the situation fearlessly and honestly and figured out what was the worst that could possibly happen as a result of this failure. No one was going to jail me or shoot me, that was certain. True, there was also a chance that I could lose my job, and there was also a chance that my employers would have to remove the machinery and lose the $20,000 we had invested. Step 2. After figuring out what was the worst that could possibly happen, I reconciled myself to accepting it, if necessary. I said to myself, this failure will be a blow to my record and it might possibly mean the loss of my job. But if it does, I can always get another position. Conditions could be much worse, and as far as my employers are concerned, well, they realize that we're experimenting with a new method of cleaning gas, and if this experience costs them $20,000, they can stand it. They can charge it up to research, for it is an experiment. After discovering the worst that could possibly happen and reconciling myself to accepting it, if necessary, an extremely important thing happened. I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in days. Step 3. From that time on, I calmly devoted my time and energy to trying to improve upon the worst which I had already accepted mentally. I now tried to figure out ways and means by which I might reduce the loss of $20,000 that we faced. I made several steps and finally figured out that if we spent another $5,000 for additional equipment, our problem would be solved. We did this, and instead of the firm losing $20,000, we made $15,000. I probably would never have been able to do this if I had kept on worrying, because one of the worst features about worrying is that it destroys the mind's ability to concentrate. When we worry, our minds jump here and there and everywhere, and we lose all power of decision. However, when we force ourselves to face the worst and accept it mentally, we then eliminate all these vague imaginings and put ourselves in a position where we are able to concentrate on our problem in the here and now. This incident that I have related occurred many years ago, It works so superbly that I've been using it ever since, and as a result, my life has been almost completely free from worry." End of quote. Now, why is Willis H. Carrier's magic formula so valuable and so practical, psychologically speaking? Because it yanks us down out of the great gray clouds in which we fumble around when we are blinded by worry. It plants our feet good and solid on the earth. We know where we stand, and if we can't have solid ground under us, how in creation can we ever hope to think anything through? Professor William James, the father of applied psychology, has been dead since 1910, but if he were alive today and could hear this formula for facing the worst, he would heartily approve. How do I know? Because he told his own students, quote, "Be willing to have it so. Be willing to have it so," he said, "because acceptance of what has happened is the first step in overcoming the consequences of any misfortune," end quote. The same idea is expressed by Lin Yutang in his widely read book, The Importance of Living. True peace of mind, says this Chinese philosopher, comes from accepting the worst. Psychologically, I think it means the release of energy. That's it exactly. Psychologically, it means a new release of energy. When we have accepted the worst, we have nothing more to lose. And that automatically means we have everything to gain. After facing the worst, Willis H. Carrier reported, "I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in days. From that time on, I was able to think." Makes sense, doesn't it? Yet millions of people have wrecked their lives in angry turmoil because they refuse to accept the worst, refuse to improve upon it, refuse to salvage what they could from the wreck. Instead of trying to reconstruct their fortunes, they engaged in a bitter and violent contest of experience and ended up victims of that brooding fixation known as melancholia. Would you like to see how someone else adopted Willis H. Carrier's magic formula and applied it to his own problem? Well, here's one example from a New York oil dealer who was a student in my classes. "I was being blackmailed," the student began. "I didn't believe it was possible. I didn't believe it could happen outside the movies, but I was actually being blackmailed." And, he goes on with the story. It's a fascinating one. How to Stop Worrying and Start Living by Dale Carnegie. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. By the way, if you're trying to call in, don't bother. I'm sorry. We have Comcast as our telephone provider, and Comcast has, in my experience, terrible service. I have Comcast Business Service at home also because we do a lot of work at home, and it seems like almost every day it's down. It was certainly down yesterday for a little bit. It was down the day before yesterday. Louise and I will both be working on our computers or trying to transfer files back and forth from here in the studio with Nate or whatever, and down goes Comcast. Business services, right? Business service. You're supposed to be 99.99%. Down goes Comcast, and so for Louise and I, 200 outages when?
Today, in the last hour.
Oh, Nate says in the last hour, 200 Comcast outages in Portland. I mean, it's just, it's insane how unreliable this is. It's just insane. It's pathetic. And so our phones aren't working. So you can't call in, and we can't call out, and so, it's going to be you and me for the next couple hours unless Comcast gets this fixed. And I want to finish my Comcast riff, and then I'm going to get into my fascist riff, because there's just I've got a lot of riffs for you anyway today, so it's just a fine day to not have phones. But to close the loop on my Comcast rant, when we lived in Vermont had a law that said that whoever brought the telephone lines or the cable lines into your home had to allow anybody else to use those lines, to rent those lines from them. Now, that sounds kind of abstract. Let me tell you exactly how it worked. Verizon had bought from Eastern Bell, I think it was, or Bell Northeast, or whatever it was after the breakup, which had originally owned all the telephone lines in Vermont, right? Because they had strung all the telephone lines all over the country. Bell had been a monopoly since the 30s. So when Bell got broken up, there was Northeast Bell. Northeast Bell got acquired by Verizon. And Verizon then, Louise and I were living in Montpelier, Vermont, and Verizon owned all the telephone wires. But I didn't want Verizon as my phone company. I didn't think well of Verizon. I had Verizon as a cellular provider for a while, and I was so upset with them that I canceled their contract. I paid the $300 fee to cancel the contract, and Louise and I went out in the backyard and had a ceremony where I dug a hole and buried my cell phone. That's how much I hated Verizon, or how much I disliked their service. And so for our phone service, I didn't want Verizon. And there was a little company in Montpelier by the name of Sovernet, S-O-V-E-R-N-E-T, because Vermont often thinks of themselves as a sovereign nation. I think this is where the name came from, and the net for network. And Sovernet was run by a couple of local guys. They literally, their offices were a block away from where our house was in downtown Montpelier, Vermont. And the price for telephone service, and this was when we were starting this show out of my home in Vermont. And Bernie used to come over and sit next to me at my desk, and we'd do this show. I wanted Sovernet to be my telephone provider. And their charge was $25 a month, flat rate, service is free, instant service, we're local, everything's cool. No fancy this or that, no special, oh, do you want this package or that package? They didn't play any of the BS games that Verizon did. It was just very straightforward. $25 a month is, per line. And so we brought 6 lines into the house. And Verizon had to come out and install the extra pieces of copper, the extra wires from the telephone pole to the house, because we were originally wired for just 2 lines, our house. And then, once Verizon got that stuff in there, once Verizon got, the cable in there, then Sovernet became my phone company over Verizon's wires. Because there was a law in Vermont that said Verizon had to, if Sovernet wanted to rent their wires, presumably it was much less than $25 a month. Let's say they paid $5 a month to Verizon. Whatever, Verizon was making a profit. Whatever the cost of maintaining that copper was, they were making a profit on it. And renting it out to Sovernet in the case of my particular home. And then Sovernet, working over that cable, just like over the internet, provided phone service. And it was perfect phone service. We never once had a problem. Actually, there were a couple of times when we did have problems, and every single time I would call the local guy, and he would walk over, and in 10 minutes the problem would be fixed. And both times it was because outside, Verizon's copper had gotten corroded, or there was something flaky or whatever, but we never had a problem with Sovernet itself. I'm pretty sure, it's been 15 years since we left Vermont, but I'm pretty sure that Vermont now is pretty much like every place else in the country, and that is that these giant companies have gotten laws passed that allow them to lock you down. So if Comcast provides the telephone line into your house, you have to have Verizon telephone or Comcast telephones. If Comcast provides the cable service into your house, you have to have Comcast cable. Now that is not the case in most of the rest of the world. Once again, we are the ripped off suckers of the planet. In France, for example, and there was a great piece about this in the New York Times a couple of years ago. In France, you can choose from more than 100 internet service providers, regardless of who is bringing the fiber or the cable or the copper into your home. Let's say that you have, I'll use American named companies just because I don't know the French named companies, but so it's a for example. But let's say that you've got, Comcast bringing, your cable TV, running the cable TV wire into your home. Comcast maintains that line. They may do it for a whole neighborhood, for your whole town. But I don't want Comcast as my internet service provider. In France, if Comcast owns the copper coming into your house, you can pick from over 100 different competing internet service providers to be your ISP. And of course, they have net neutrality, which, by the way, ends on Monday in the United States. One more tightening of the screws, one more deepening of the clamp of the corporate boot on the iron corporate boot, to quote President Grover Cleveland's 1887 annual State of the Union address, where he talked about the iron heel of corporate America is upon the neck of the average citizen. That was the Gilded Age. Well, we're here again. So if I'm in France and I've got Comcast bringing it into my house, but I'd really rather have, you know, AOL or CompuServe or Spirit One, or Spirit One used to be an ISP here in Oregon. In fact, we had them keep our old website up for a long, long time. They just seem to have died in the last few months. But say I wanted Spirit One as my internet service provider. I would just call them up and say, hey, what do you charge? And they'd say, well, you know, we charge $45 a month or $33 a month or whatever. I mean, everybody had different prices, right? You pick whoever what services do you offer? Well, here's the speed you can get and all this kind of stuff. And they become your internet service provider, even though Comcast owns the copper. Comcast then finds themselves in a position where they would have to compete with these companies, where they're hoping that you'll pick them as your internet service provider. That's called competition. That's something that Republicans and conservatives always give lip service to, and when they do, they are lying. They are simply lying. To quote Vice President Henry Wallace, April 9th, 1944, in the New York Times, they claim to be super patriots, but they would destroy every liberty guaranteed by the Constitution. They demand free enterprise, but they are the spokesman for monopoly and vested interest. The final objective toward which all their deceit is directed is to capture political power so that using the power of the state and the power of the market simultaneously, they may keep the common man in eternal subjection. You know, we were talking earlier about the problem that millennials have. People have to have internet service. But here we have these monopsonies. You know, you have one, maybe two, maybe three, but probably not companies that you can choose from to get your internet service. You know, and that's it. And if they own the copper, or if they own the cable, or if they own the fiber coming into your house, you are toast. You've got to work with them. That's it. You have no other choice. In the rest of the world, they don't allow these companies to operate like these kinds of monopolies. Only here in the stupid United States, and I say stupid in that we have allowed ourselves to be duped by these billionaires and politicians and these giant corporations and the politicians they own, to the point that now they own the media to the point. I mean, keep in mind, Comcast owns MSNBC and NBC. You're not going to hear this conversation that I just shared with you on any of these corporate networks. AT&T is trying to buy CNN. You think you're going to hear about this on CNN? This is where we're at right now. This is why you can't call into this show right now. Because I don't have a choice. There's no competition. This is how pathetic it has gotten in this country. Okay, so, you know, nice little rant there, and this, by the way, Henry Wallace said that, you know, fascism's greatest threat to the United States will come after the war within the United States itself. He said, if we define an American fascist as one who puts in case of conflict, puts money and power ahead of human beings, then there are undoubtedly several million fascists in the United States. There are probably several 100,000 if we narrow the definition to include only those who in their search for money and power are ruthless and deceitful. They are patriotic in time of war because it is in their interest to be so, but in time of peace they follow power and the dollar wherever they may lead. Which brings us to what Trump is doing right now with the Veterans Administration. And if you're a veteran, or you know a veteran, or there's a veteran in your family, stick around. In 4 minutes, I'm going to give you the whole story. The story you're probably not hearing on television. I had MSNBC on, and they played Trump in his entirety, all his bragging, and I'm like, screw this. I went to CNN, you know, in the TV here in our studio, and CNN does not have Trump on. I'm over it with MSNBC. Every time Donald Trump shows up to say anything, putting him on the air. I get it.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Trump deregulated the internet, killed net neutrality for Comcast. Comcast owns MSNBC. MSNBC puts Trump on at the drop of a hat. I get it. Hey, Steve, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, thanks for taking my call. Last night, Bernie Sanders was on Rachel Maddow, and he did something and said something which I really appreciated, and that was a kind of talked about strategy, and that the resistance is really important. It's a critical part of the strategy, but it comes with also continuing to push progressive agenda because that's what the country wants. So we have to resist Donald Trump and push for $15 an hour.
Yeah.
And push for free college tuition and push for expanding Social Security, not just preserving it. And all of these things have to happen at the same time, which makes our job that much more difficult. But I really appreciated hearing that the party and the left has to be more than just being opposed to Trump. They actually have to be for progressive agendas, and that I just wanted to share that with you. And I really
and that's what people want. Steve, in 1981, one of the advisors to I think it was Lee Atwater, one of the advisors to Ronald Reagan, I may be wrong on exactly who it was, but I'm pretty sure it was Lee Atwater, came up with this idea of what he referred to as the perpetual campaign. Kevin Phillips, I think, later wrote a book about this. And basically was every single day that goes by should be an opportunity to get some press that will cause more people, more kind of undecided people or low information people to think you're doing a great job, your party's doing a great job, and the next election comes, I really should vote for you. And Reagan was the first presidency where we saw this continual, perpetual campaign. He campaigned, or he or his surrogates, literally every day of the 8 years that he was president. And that was not something that was picked up by Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton didn't have to do it methodically because he was such a brilliant politician himself. He was always down on the Hill, glad-handing people and talking to people and talking to the press and stuff. And of course, it would have been very difficult given all the impeachment hearings and whatnot. But basically, every Republican has done this, and the Obama administration did not even remotely consider doing something like this. They have done the opposite of this. They've basically kind of said, we're governing things. We've got this. Chill out. Don't worry. We've got this under control. And that, obviously has not worked well. And I didn't see Bernie on Rachel last night because I was in bed by then. But I have read the articles about it. I saw a clip of it this morning. And it looks to me like what Bernie is proposing is that Democrats start doing what Republicans figured out works in 1980.
Can I add one more thing?
Please.
I think when people are saying we want leadership that fights, to me what that means is we may not have the votes necessarily to win, but we'll still push legislation that pushes progressive agendas. So we may not have the votes to get like $15 an hour on the federal level, but if we still push it and Republicans vote it down, or if we still push for free college tuition and Republicans vote it down, at least we're fighting for the things that we believe in.
Yep.
And I know that's something I would appreciate, and I think most of the country would appreciate it too, because most of the country, I think across the political aisle, still wants these progressive agendas.
We are, we're a progressive country. There's just no doubt about that. There's, any poll will tell you that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Steve, thank you for the call, and thanks for watching Free Speech TV. We'll be back in and thanks for the great observation, by the way, Steve. I really think that this is the key to the whole thing. Is now for the next, now I was going to say for the next 4 years, maybe now forever, the Democrats, progressive Democrats, need to get up and get out there, get organized and get out there every single day with their message. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. XChairTom.com is the website, XChairTHOM.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeets.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. By Super Beets at Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com. Let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Ellen Ratner's new book, Loving What You Do. And speaking of Ellen Ratner, she is on the line with us. Hey, Ellen.
How are you doing? So what's really fascinating is that NASA is now talking about taking over the space station, but using private groups to do it.
Wait a minute, you're talking the space station that the Russians built and put up there?
That's right, that very same space station.
Whoa.
And they're talking about a private takeover. I can't even believe it. But wow. Hey, look, you know, we have a president that believes in private enterprise, so there you have it.
Well, this is what Henry Wallace was predicting on April 9th, 1944 in the New York Times, that eventually the day would come when governments were no longer the forces that controlled and supported people's lives, that it was entirely private corporations. Henry Wallace, by the way, referred to that as fascism.
Right. Well, there you have it.
Yeah.
Okay. So a judge was recalled in California. There was a vote yesterday. I'm actually in California. Aaron Persky, he had sentenced a student at Stanford University to 6 months for sexual assault. He was taken out of it was an elected judgeship position. He had 4 years left to go, but he was taken out because he gave such a lenient sentence. Now, also, there were primaries held yesterday around the country. There were 8 primaries held. There was one held in California. California is the only state in the union where the 2 top winners, it doesn't matter what party they are, go against each other. So Governor Newsom is actually going against, well, he's not a governor yet, but he's was the Mayor Newsom of San Francisco, is actually going against a Republican. However, the lieutenant governor's race are 2 Democrats going against each other. So it's really very interesting what has happened in the terms of the primary. In New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham is going against Congressman Steve Pence, Pierce, sorry, and he is running, he's leaving his congressional seat, and it also looks like Deborah Haaland might be, if she wins her race, she would be the first woman who is of Native American heritage to win for Congress. Tonight, President Trump is having an iftar dinner. That is the dinner that is held at the end of Ramadan, at the end of a day of Ramadan, not at the end of Ramadan. And it's interesting, the CAIR, which is the American Islamic Relations Committee, is having their own iftar dinner, and they're having it in the place right across the street from the White House, the park there. So that's going to be very interesting. Last year, of course, the president did not have a dinner, but that's going to be extremely interesting to see what happens on that front. Also, there's a G7 meeting. It begins in Canada at lunch on Friday. And what's so interesting is that we're expecting that Trump is going to hear it full force from a lot of the G7 members for putting on the tariffs that he has just put on.
That's great. And let me just, for our listeners, Ellen's audio is a little bit unusual, and that's because we're bringing her in by Skype, because our phones are provided by Comcast, and Comcast has failed us today. Back to you.
Okay. Okay, back to me. There looks like there is going to be a summit on June 12th. That is going to be happening in Singapore, and none other than the basketball star is known for coming to the June 7th, Dennis Rodman. We don't know who invited him, whether he was invited by Kim Jong-un or whether he was invited by President Trump. And also President Trump is thinking of doing a follow-up summit at Mar-a-Lago, perhaps in October, if this one goes well. Now, it's very interesting. It is Gay Lesbian Month, June, Pride Month. And of course, the president is not doing a reception as Obama did. But it's very interesting. Ambassador Haley, who everybody thinks is running for president, she's the ambassador to the United Nations.
Nikki Haley, yeah.
Well, she is actually issued a gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans statement today saying that they don't approve of discrimination of any form. Now, that's very unbelievable that she did that when the Trump administration has been totally mum about it.
Interesting.
So the Social Security Fund runs out of money in 2034, and they will be going right to their trust fund for it.
Yeah, unless they raise the cap.
Right.
Which, you know, and now this VA bill that Trump just signed doesn't have any funding associated with it. They're saying you got to cut someplace, like maybe Social Security, to get that money.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Thanks.
Thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
From
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairtom.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeets.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. Last night, Bernie Sanders was on Rachel Maddow, and he did something and said something which I really appreciated, and that was a kind of talked about strategy, and that the resistance is really important. It's a critical part of the strategy, but it comes with also continuing to push progressive agenda because that's what the country wants. So we have to resist Donald Trump and push for $15 an hour and push for free college tuition and push for expanding Social Security, not just preserving it. And all of these things have to happen at the same time, which makes our job that much more difficult. But I really appreciated hearing that the party and the left has to be more than just being opposed to Trump. They actually have to be for progressive agendas, and that I just wanted to share that with you. And I really
and that's what people. Actions inimical to worker safety. Others included no longer posting press releases about deaths resulting from unsafe working conditions, delaying rules to reduce sickness and death from inhaling silica and beryllium at work, delaying rules to lower the risk of railroad engineers and truck drivers falling asleep at the switch or wheel because of untreated sleep apnea, and the appointment to the Supreme Court of a judge who held that a company had the right to fire a worker who chose not to freeze to death on the job. A reasonable person listening to Donald Trump's inaugural address would never have expected these and other actions, assuming he believed what Trump said. Trump declared, "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no more. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens," end quote. Those men and women were forgotten again the following week. And it's not just workers whose interests were forgotten, not to mention who were put in danger. By deciding not to implement a rule to reduce the chances of truck drivers and train operators falling asleep at the wheel, Trump put at risk the lives of families driving along the highway, people riding on passenger trains, and many others. The White House called it President Trump's war on regulation. In his weekly radio address in early May, he declared that we've removed one job-killing regulation after another, and they're not pretty, and they're going. And believe me, we're just getting started on regulations. They're gone. Removal of data on workplace deaths, which averaged 13 per day, infuriated Jordan Barab, who was Obama's number 2 at OSHA. As a private citizen, Barab created a webpage to keep track of the names of the dead and the reasons they were killed on the job. He called it, "OSHA won't tell you who died in the workplace, we will." After the election, Barab's concerns that the Trump administration would be bad for workers increased when he asked where the Trump beachhead team was and learned that none was coming. Each incoming administrator sends people to scope out federal agencies, learn who does what, and get a feel for the place in advance. Then the incoming administration sends its landing team, the people who will initially implement its policies for each agenda or at each agency. When no beachhead team came up, Barab figured it meant worker safety simply was not a priority for Trump. He hoped that was the worst of it, nothing more than apathy about worker safety. But when the landing team arrived, Barab realized trouble was coming for American workers, and it was not official apathy, but the start of assaults on workers' rights and safety. Barab said most of them had no idea they were going to labor and no interest in workers' issues either. What they did have was a mandate to delay, repeal, or weaken regulations that protected workers as part of Trump's plan to eliminate, quote, any regulation that is outdated, unnecessary, bad for workers, or contrary to the national interest, end quote. The first sign came when Trump nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Gorsuch was an acolyte of Antonin Scalia, whose seat he would be taking. Like Scalia, he said statutes should be literally read, and if that made no sense, well, that was a problem for Congress. Also like Scalia, he had a habit of consulting dictionaries, often following Scalia's practice of relying on the third, fourth, or even lesser definition of a word when it supported his jurisprudence. Trump's nomination alarmed unions. Jody Calamine, a communications worker of America lawyer, told Gorsuch's Senate confirmation hearing that Gorsuch, quote, is a threat to working people's health and safety, end quote. Calamine cited Gorsuch's dissent in the 2016 case to make his point. That dissent, he said, reveals an anti-worker bias and features a judicial activism that will ultimately put workers' lives at risk, end quote. Those are unusually strong words about a Supreme Court nominee, but a review of the case shows Gorsuch has little regard for human life, at least when it comes to employers' power over their workers. He considers a rigid interpretation of the law more important. The case was about a law Congress passed giving workers the right to refuse dangerous tasks. Gorsuch said, no, you may not refuse. It's even worse than you think, by David K. Johnston. Both above and to extract type of stick. Her, often guided her.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We were planning on doing an hour with Lamar Waldron to talk about the assassination of Bobby Kennedy 50 years ago today. Lamar is right now trying to figure out if he can make Skype work on his phone because his computer is not working today. And if he does, we may be able to get him in and have at least part of that conversation. But I'm not optimistic, and so we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, I want to finish the rant that I started in the previous hour, and I'm not talking about the rant about Comcast and about monopolies and how phone companies and cable companies should be required by law, like they are in Europe, to rent their copper lines to any provider, any internet service provider or telephone service provider who wants to pay them a profitable rate and then market their services to the public. That rant, I think, stands on its own. But I want to get back to how we're all being robbed and who's doing the robbing. And the robbing, of course, is the billionaire class that Donald Trump is a member of, along with, the other billionaires in his cabinet, Betsy DeVos, Wilbur Ross, et cetera, and the multimillionaires in his cabinet, and the multimillionaires in Congress, and the billionaires who own them. And and how, broadly speaking, the Trump administration, the equation, the formula that they've come up with, the strategy that they have employed, is one that is, frankly, an old Republican trick. When Paul Manafort was working for Reagan, when Paul Manafort was running Jerry Ford's campaign, when Paul Manafort was working for George Herbert Walker Bush, Paul Manafort and his partner in his company, Lee Atwater, understood, in addition to the whole race baiting thing that they turned into an art form, they also understood that David Ogilvy's old admonition from Ogilvy and Mather, the famous ad company back in the day, O&M, David Ogilvy famously said, "Sell the sizzle, not the steak." Right? People want the what's in it for me? Why should I care? Sell the sizzle, right? So Trump just did this thing at the White House in front of a bunch of vets, and using them as props, cynically, disgustingly. And you'll understand in a moment why I said disgustingly. He just celebrated the signing of a piece of legislation that the Republicans pushed through that accelerates the process of privatizing the Veterans Administration. Now, that in and of itself is arguably, potentially, pretty awful. It depends on how it's handled. What this legislation does is it says that if you're a veteran and you qualify for VA services and you don't want to go to the local VA, you can go to any doctor you want, and the VA will have to pay for it. And that doctor can basically charge anything they want. They're not doing it through like the Medicare system or the Medicaid system where there are already established rates and here's what we'll pay and all that kind of thing. No, just go. Have fun. Now, about a third of all veterans are already getting services from private facilities. But the reason why is not because they privatized the VA. It's because, America's a very, very large country physically. And the VA can't have offices everywhere. And so if you live more than a certain distance from a VA office, and I frankly don't know, I think I did know at one time, but don't know the distance that you have to live from the VA. But if you live, 100 miles away or 150 miles away or 50 miles away or whatever it is, whatever that number is, then you can use a local vendor. You don't have to drive to the Veterans Administration, to the VA hospital, unless it's like you're going in for a hip replacement or something, then, you get to go to the VA hospital. So what this legislation is saying, if I understand this correctly, and I'm looking at a piece of an article in today's Washington Post by Erica Werner and Lisa Rain. It's titled "Trump to Sign Veterans Bill as White House Works Against Plan to Fund." And that's the scam. What they're saying, and this is very straightforward, what this will do is it'll say basically any veteran anywhere, even if you live next door to the Veterans Administration hospital, you can still go to your private doctor and the VA will pay for it. So here's the opening of the article. President Trump is preparing to sign a sweeping new law Wednesday, that's today, aimed at expanding veterans' access to private sector health care. But behind the scenes, and this is the part, you know, when MSNBC just played Trump doing his whole propaganda shtick, and I got so disgusted I went to CNN, and thank God Trump's face was not on the screen. I doubt anybody pointed out that there are two necessary steps to legislation. See, this is the thing. You know, this is why I think talk radio is such a useful and important thing when, in this age of pathetic media, is that I can take a few minutes and I can actually explain to you what's going on, and you know, don't have any corporate pressure, not owned by any billionaires or giant corporations, and can basically just tell you what's going on. Because I don't think that what you learned is that basically there's two pieces to legislation. There is the law that makes something happen, and then there is the appropriation of money to pay for that to happen. Now, often, typically, commonly, those two things are combined in the same legislation. We will create a program where veterans can go to any doctor that they want, and the Veterans Administration will have to pay the bill. And we're guessing it's going to cost about $50 billion. But, you know, we don't know. But we're guessing. So here's the law. The VA has to pay the bill. Pass the law. That's what happened. And Donald Trump signed it and said, isn't this wonderful? We're doing wonderful things for our veterans. Privatizing the VA, starting the speeding up the destruction of the Veterans Administration. But the thing that they're not telling you, although the Washington Post did in this lead article, which is probably why Trump is constantly ragging on Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, and the Washington Post itself. The thing that they're not telling you is, and I quote from the second paragraph of today's Washington Post, the VA Mission Act authorizes new health care programs for veterans. Remember, that was the first half of legislation I'm telling you about? It authorizes it. But the bill does not reserve federal money to pay for those programs. In other words, there's no appropriation. There's no setting aside of cash to pay for it. A group of powerful Senate committee chairmen aims to remedy that by amending a separate measure to pay for the new $50 billion law. But the White House is engaged in a quiet effort to thwart the senator's plan, encouraging lawmakers to vote it down and instead asking Congress to pay for the veterans programs by cutting spending elsewhere. Now, you know he's not going to cut spending at the Pentagon. He's not going to cut his little border wall thing, although it hasn't been funded yet. So where else do you cut? Well, you got food stamps, you got housing assistance, you got infrastructure. You've got, I mean, they're not going to cut the $100 billion a year in subsidies that we give to the fossil fuel billionaires. That's, I guarantee you, that's not going to get cut. You got Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. You know, if you're a Republican and you're looking around for $50 billion to help privatize the Veterans Administration, which on its face, by the way, should seem absurd. Wait a minute, we're spending an extra $50 billion to get the exact same results? People are still seeing doctors just like they used to see doctors? But it's costing us $50 billion more because instead of going to the VA facility where the doctors are government employees, they're going to go to a private doc who's you know, making $1 million a year. But the bottom line is they're making this happen, and then they're going to cut elsewhere. White House, again, back to the article by Eric Warner and Lisa Rain in today's Washington Post in the business section. You can read it yourself. The White House is engaged in a quiet effort to thwart the senator's plan, encouraging lawmakers to vote it down and instead asking Congress to pay for the veterans programs by cutting spending elsewhere. White House officials are circulating a memo on Capitol Hill this week that slams the senator's proposal as, quote, anathema to responsible spending, end quote. and that predicts it would lead to ballooning costs and, quote, virtually unlimited increases, end quote, in veterans' spending on private health care. And that's the key to the whole thing. As I said in the very beginning, they didn't attach, with Medicare and Medicaid, we know what it's going to cost based on how many people are in the system. Because we know, broadly speaking, what people use at what age or what stage in their lives. And we also know what we're going to pay for it because they have a schedule. If somebody on Medicare goes in to get an appendectomy, there's a certain specific amount of money that will be paid for that. If they go in to get their tonsils removed, there's a certain specific amount. You show up with a broken leg or arm, they have a payment schedule. And doctors and hospitals are perfectly willing to do it. It's a reasonable payment schedule, but it's a schedule. It's not, hey, whatever you want to charge. But by privatizing the VA, this is very much like the poison pill they put in the legislation for the post office. This is very much like that, where they had to, for 10 years, the post office had to set aside an extra $5 billion a year to pay for the health care of postal workers 75 years from now. It was just a poison pill. It was just to destroy the post office. This is a poison pill to destroy the VA because there are no limits on the spending. They're estimating it's going to be $50 billion this year that they're going to have to take from other programs in order to pay for veterans to go to private doctors instead of VA doctors and get the exact same service. They're estimating it's going to be $50 billion. But as the Republicans are pointing out in their own damn memo, there could be, quote, virtually unlimited increases, end quote, because there's not a payment schedule. It's not attached to it. There's nothing. It's just, hey, yeah, go, have fun. This is a cynical plan by the Republican Party and the Trump administration to privatize the Veterans Administration to make more profit for their buddies in the hospital business, in the medical practices business, in the drug business. All of these private industries are going to make out like fortune. Well, they're handing them $50 billion just this year, estimated. It might be $100 billion next year. It might be $300 billion after that. And where are they going to take that money from? Probably out of your Social Security check or out of your food stamps.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Or out of your long-term unemployment, or out of the budget of the agency that protects your bank from robbing you, or that keeps the factory down the street from poisoning you. And Barbara in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hey, Barbara, thanks for watching Free Speech. What's up?
Hey, Tom, how are you doing today?
I'm fine.
You know what? I watched this election go, and 3 weeks ago, I knew how it was going to go.
Yeah.
Because I knew what some parts of America wanted.
Well, I knew it was possible, and throughout this election, I got a note from another talk show host over the weekend titled Apology, and he said, when I had you on my show a couple of months ago, and you said that it was possible that Trump could win, I was absolutely shocked, and I never believed it, and you were right. And I take no, and I've been saying that all along. It's why I've been, pushing people to get out and vote for Clinton, even though she wasn't my first choice, because I thought that Trump actually had a good chance of winning. I mean, I know Middle America. I grew up in Michigan. Back to you, Barbara. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Excuse me. Here's one thing that I really want America to pay attention to. When people say the popular vote don't count, yes, it does. For as far as I'm concerned, Donald Trump is not my president. I will never call him President Trump.
Yeah.
His band of bigots that run with him, that's their problem. But the people that voted for Donald Trump, they are fixing to find out the hard way. And I'm not going to feel sorry for him.
Yeah.
Second of all, I praise my president, Barack Hussein Obama, for the dignity, the grace, and the honor that he showed to a man that demeaned him every step of the way. This is why the man has a Nobel Peace Prize. See, America doesn't know this about our president. Donald Trump is going to try to use some of his programs and make them his. Mitch McConnell is smiling. Paul Ryan is smiling. But I'm here to tell them, we are America. I am black. I'm not scared of any man, with a sheet or without a sheet.
Good on
Do
you.
not walk up on me and go to talking out the side of your head, because I'm not going to take it. I'm an American. My father fought for this country. My brother fought for this country. My uncle fought for this country. I am an American, and you're not going to tell me what I can and cannot say, and you're not going to tell me that I can and cannot protest. To the children of America, keep marching. Don't quit marching. Keep marching. Let this man know, no.
Yeah, I'm completely with you.
On my heart.
In fact, I had intended to open the show by talking about the marches all over the country, and I got mentally derailed. I've got to get back to that as soon as the break is over, or at the next break. But I think you're absolutely right, Barbara, and obviously you're a courageous person. Good on you for saying it.
I mean it with all my heart. I literally mean it with all my heart.
Yeah.
This is my doggone country.
Yeah.
And no plutocrat or whatever they want to call themselves is going to stand and tell me how I can and can't live in my country.
Yeah.
God bless America. America's great, and America, keep fighting.
Yeah.
Keep fighting on. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Barbara. Well said. Well said. And this is what I'm calling on Chuck Schumer to do, is to say no to everything they bring forward. It's going to take 60 votes to pass anything through this, or it should. This is. Keep in mind, for the last 8 years, and the press never even commented on this, by the way. The extension of long-term unemployment insurance. It had enough votes to pass the Senate, but it was filibustered by the Republicans. The press didn't even mention. They just said, "Oh, they failed to hit the 60-vote limit." Now, when the Democrats do that, is the press going to say, "Oh, the Democrats filibustered it"? I'm guessing they probably will, because our press in this country is largely right-wing and Republican. Believe that.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairtom.com is the website, xchairtom.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeats.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thom Hartmann here with you. As we dig into what's going on with Comcast, we discover that it looks like there are Comcast telephone service outages all over the country. A friend of Nate's in Oakland texted him that he's lost his Comcast business line services. We've lost ours, of course, which is why you can't call in, and why this hour, we were going to do the entire hour on Bobby Kennedy with Lamar Waldron. We're going to reschedule that for tomorrow. And because it's a really important thing, and it's the 60th anniversary, and I'll just leave it at that. I'm not going to try and do a half-assed job of memorializing Bobby Kennedy. We will do it tomorrow, and it'll be just as good. And but looking at the heat map of Comcast telephone outages, we're seeing that they're happening all over the country, and which raises two interesting points. Maybe three, but the first two that are obvious. And by the way, Nate and Arthur are printing out for me your comments on YouTube and Facebook, and I'm watching Twitter on my computer right here in front of me. And so rather than taking calls as we continue through the program, after I finish all the rants that I had planned for the day, I'll be responding to your tweets or to your comments on Facebook or YouTube. Twitter gets right to me. Facebook or YouTube goes through Nate or Arthur, and they have to print it out and mark it up, so it may take a little longer, but just FYI. But the two things that this raises, the two interesting things that this raises, this Comcast nationwide failure, is number one, might this be the Chinese or the Iranians or somebody saying, hey, you know, or the North Koreans saying, let us show you what we can do if you really want to mess with us. And if it's not them doing that, we need to think about what happens if they do, number one. And number two, it shows the fragility, how fragile an ecosystem is, in this case a telephone ecosystem, when it is lacking diversity. If there were, like in France, over 100 different companies competing to provide me with bundled telephone and internet service over the copper lines coming into my building, then there would be 100 different companies that the Chinese or whoever it is would have to take down. Or if one big company like Comcast had a massive equipment failure, which may be what's going on, it wouldn't take out the country. But instead, because of this monopsony, this is where we're at, right? This situation around the country. So this is another strong argument for doing away with these monopolies that only help the billionaires and the giant corporations and the Republicans that they own, and a few Democrats, tragically.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour. I want to finish my rant about fascism after the break, and then I'll pick up your tweets. Stick around. In the Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from Michael Pollan's new book, How to Change Your Mind, what the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. This is from the prologue titled A New Door. Midway through the 20th century, two unusual new molecules, organic compounds with a striking family resemblance, exploded upon the West. In time, they would change the course of social, political, and cultural history, as well as the personal histories of the millions of people who would eventually introduce them to their brains. As it happened, the arrival of these disruptive chemistries coincided with another world historical explosion, that of the atomic bomb. There were people who compared the two events and made much of the cosmic synchronicity. Extraordinary new energies had been loosed upon the world. Things would never quite be the same. The first of these molecules was an accidental invention of science. Lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly known as LSD, was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1938, shortly before physicists split the atom of uranium for the first time. Hofmann, who worked for the Swiss pharmaceutical firm Sandoz, had been looking for a drug to stimulate circulation, not a psychoactive compound. It wasn't until 5 years later, when he accidentally ingested a minuscule quantity of the new chemical, that he realized he had created something powerful, at once terrifying and wondrous. The second molecule had been around for thousands of years, though no one in the developed world was aware of it. Produced not by a chemist, by an inconspicuous little brown mushroom, this molecule, which would come to be known as psilocybin, had been used by indigenous peoples of Mexico and Central America for hundreds of years as a sacrament. Called Teotihuacan by the Aztecs, or flesh of the gods, the mushroom was brutally suppressed by the Roman Catholic Church after the Spanish conquest and driven underground. In 1955, 12 years after Albert Hofmann's discovery of LSD, a Manhattan banker and amateur mycologist named R. Gordon Wasson sampled the magic mushroom in the town of Huajuapan de Jimenez in the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca. 2 years later, he published a 15-page account of the, quote, mushrooms that cause strange visions, end quote, in Life magazine, marking the moment when news of a new form of consciousness first reached the general public. Parentheses, in 1957, knowledge of LSD was mostly confined to the community of researchers and mental health professionals. People would not realize the magnitude of what had happened for several more years, but history in the West had shifted. The impact of these two molecules is hard to overestimate. The advent of LSD can be linked to the revolution in brain science that begins in the 1950s, when scientists discovered the role of neurotransmitters in the brain. The quantities of LSD measured in micrograms could produce quantities of LSD measured in micrograms could produce symptoms resembling psychosis, inspired brain scientists to search for the neurochemical basis of mental disorders previously believed to be of psychological origin. At the same time, psychedelics found their way into psychotherapy, where they were used to treat a variety of disorders, including alcoholism, anxiety, and depression. For most of the 1950s and early 60s, many in the psychiatric establishment regarded LSD and psilocybin as miracle drugs. The arrival of these two compounds is also linked to the rise of the counterculture during the 1960s, and perhaps especially to its particular tone and style. For the first time in history, the young had a rite of passage all their own, the acid trip. Instead of folding the young into the adult world, as rites of passage have always done, this one landed them in a country of the mind few adults had any idea even existed. The effect on society was, to put it mildly, disruptive. Yet by the end of the 1960s, the social and political shockwaves unleashed by these molecules seemed to dissipate. The dark side of psychedelics began to receive tremendous amounts of publicity: bad trips, psychotic breaks, flashbacks, suicides. And beginning in 1965, the exuberance surrounding these new drugs gave way to moral panic. As quickly as the culture and the scientific establishment had embraced psychedelics, they now turned sharply against them. By the end of the decade, psychedelic drugs, which had been legal in most places, were outlawed and forced underground. At least one of the 20th century's two bombs appeared to have been defused. Then something unexpected and telling happened. Beginning in the 1990s, well out of the view of most of us, a small group of scientists, psychotherapists, and so-called psychonauts, believing that something precious had been lost from both science and culture, resolved to recover it. Today, after several decades of suppression and neglect, psychedelics are having a renaissance. A new generation of scientists, many of them inspired by their own personal experience of the compounds, are testing their potential to heal mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, trauma, and addiction. Other scientists are using psychedelics in conjunction with new brain imaging tools to explore the links between brain and mind, hoping to unravel some of the mysteries of consciousness itself. One good way to understand a complex system is to disturb it and then see what happens. By smashing atoms, a particle accelerator forces them to yield their secrets. By administering psychedelics in carefully calibrated doses, neuroscientists can profoundly disturb the normal waking consciousness of volunteers, dissolving the structures of the self and occasioning what can be described as a mystical experience. How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. Okay, just to recap very, very quickly, in the first hour, I started out talking in our program here, I started talking about the richest 10% taking 85% of all the new wealth that's been created since the recession. But basically, I'd say probably the richest 10% have taken more than 85% of all wealth that's been created since Reaganism went into effect. Reaganism, also known as neoliberalism, also known as voodoo economics, also known as trickle-down economics. This has been the dominant economic system in the United States since 1981, in the United Kingdom since 1978, and it's spreading across Europe now just in the last decade. And it took down Greece, it took down Spain, it took down Portugal. But it's making the rich people rich. The rich people in Greece today are richer than they ever were. The rich people in Spain today are richer than they ever were. The rich people in Portugal today are richer than they ever were. The rich people in England are richer than they ever were. The rich people in the United States are richer than they ever were. Reaganism, Thatcherism, neoliberalism, voodoo economics, trickle-down economics, whatever you call it, it's all the same thing. It's got three core principles: privatize government functions so that the corporations and billionaires can make money off things that we all need, like, you know, sewer and water and roads and you name it, right? Privatize government functions, cut taxes on rich people, and then using those tax cuts, of course, defund your social welfare programs, destroy the welfare state. And you justify that by your tax cuts. which is exactly, I mean, this is the playbook the Trump administration is running. They have taken Reaganism and they've injected it with testosterone, a white race-based testosterone. I mean, they're hypercharging this stuff economically, and then as people are injured economically, they're saying, and by the way, it's all the fault of those brown people, which is a whole nother rant that I'll be getting into in just a minute. But just to finish this one, I was talking about how the millennials, now the bottom 50% of millennials have $8,000 less net worth, and they were in the negative to begin with, $8,000 less net worth than they did in 2001. They've been wiped out. The richest 1%, the average 1%er made $6.7 million extra since the crash. The average millennial has lost $8,000, the average in the bottom 50%. And that part of how that's being done is this massive ripoff. I was talking about, Toys R Us, and how Toys R Us got taken down by Mitt Romney's company, Bain Capital, and how their disgraced CEO, Dave Brandon, got paid, along with most of his executives, got paid huge, multi-million-dollar bonuses. And then they filed bankruptcy, and then they screwed the workers. Bain and two partners, KKR and Vornado Realty Trust, this is from David Dayen's piece in today's Nation, The Nation, bought Toys R Us in 2005 in a leveraged buyout. I already explained to you, how much it was, $5.3 billion in debt that they stuck the company with. They told the company, you've got to pay it back. I mean, this is an amazing deal, right? Can you imagine if I came to you and let's say you own your own house and your house is worth $100,000. And I came to you and I said, I'm going to buy your house from you, but I'm going to let you keep living in it. I will own it, but you're going to owe the debt on it. I'm going to take out a loan. I'm going to go down to Bank of America and take out a $100,000 loan, and you have to repay it. And I'm going to use that $100,000 to pay off your mortgage, buy your house. Let's say you had a $100,000 mortgage on your house. I'm going to use that $100,000 to pay off your mortgage. So I now own your house, but you owe Bank of America $100,000. And you have to work your butt off until you've paid that $100,000 to Bank of America to pay off that $100,000 debt so that I will own your house free and clear. And maybe I'll continue to let you live there after that. Can you imagine? That's how private equity works. They come to a business. They went to Toys R Us. They said, hey, nice business. I see it would sell for around $6 billion. We're going to borrow $5.3 billion, and you're going to pay it back, Toys R Us, at the rate of $500 million a year. And if that puts you out of business and throws 33,000 Americans out of work, you'd think Donald Trump would be talking about this. He's supposed to be worried about the American worker. No, he doesn't give a rat's ass about the American worker. He's concerned about Chinese workers. He's saving a Chinese company that's got 60,000 Chinese workers in exchange for a $500 million investment in his hotel in Indonesia and 14 patents for his daughter Ivanka. But he doesn't care about American workers. Let's tell the truth here. And apparently neither does the media, because nobody else, to the best of my knowledge, is talking about 33,000 people losing their jobs because Ronald Reagan legalized this kind of a scheme. That seems crazy on its face. I mean, just flat out crazy on its face. And by the way, this is not the first. I was working at Clear Channel when Bain Capital took them over. I was doing the morning show on KPOJ, one of the Clear Channel stations here in Portland. In addition to this show, I was doing 6 hours of radio a day. And Bain Capital buys them, and we had a vibrant 5-station pod, the Clear Channel had built. And over 30 employees, people working there. Good people, good paying jobs. We were unionized. And Bain comes in, boom, the union's gone. Boom, out of those 30 people, about half of them were fired in the first year. The newsroom used to have 13, 14 people in it. It was down to one guy when I left, as I recall. And then, of course, you know, I mean, they had to do that. They had to do all these cuts, Clear Channel did, because they had to pay the debt that Bain had saddled them with. Bain bought Clear Channel, and then they said, Clear Channel, you pay the bill. We get the ownership. And in the end, they couldn't do it. They went bankrupt. They changed their name to iHeartMedia. They're just now emerging from bankruptcy. I mean, this, you know, it's like I saw this in my own life, right? I knew these people who got laid off, who had their. I remember one guy who did voiceover stuff and commercials and things. Great voice, but he was in his mid to late 50s, and when he got laid off from a good job at Clear Channel, we kept in touch for probably 6 months, a year. Just, you know, catch up and email every now and then. And of course, he was hoping I could help him find another job in media. He never did. Nobody wants to hire a guy in his 50s. And if they do, they're going to pay $7.50 an hour. Or whatever the minimum wage is here in Oregon. I think it's around $10 now, but you get my point. So this is how they do this. This is how they screw us. And Toys R Us was a profitable company, and had it not had to pay for Bain Capital's debt, there would still be 33,000 Americans with a job today. But are you hearing about that from Trump? Are you hearing about that from CNN or MSNBC or NBC or ABC or CBS? I mean, I'm reading about it in thenation.com. And, you know, similarly, you've got Trump's scam with the Veterans Administration that the media just all fell for, hook, line, and sinker. The only piece I saw pushing back on it was in the Washington Post. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. On April 9th, 1944, well, a few weeks earlier, we were in the middle of World War II. Well, not in the middle of it, toward the end of it, but we were in the worst part of World War II. And the New York Times reached out to the Vice President of the United States, Henry Wallace. He was FDR's third vice president. Excuse me, his second vice president. Truman was his third. Reached out to Henry Wallace and said, and I quote, what is a fascist? How many fascists do we have in the United States, and how dangerous are they? These are the questions they asked Henry Wallace. And here's what Henry Wallace wrote on April 9th, 1944. You can still read it on the New York Times. If you subscribe to the New York Times, you can get into their archives. It's still there. That's how I got it. Henry Wallace wrote, the American fascist would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channels of public information. The really dangerous American fascists are not those who are hooked up directly or indirectly with the Nazis. The FBI has its finger on those. The dangerous American fascist is a man whose method is to poison the channels of public information. With a fascist, the problem is never how best to present the truth to the public, but how best to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money and more power. If we define an American fascist, the Vice President of the United States wrote in 1944 for the New York Times, if we define an American fascist as one who, in case of conflict, puts money and power ahead of human beings, then there are undoubtedly several million fascists in the United States. There are probably several 100,000 if we narrow the definition to include only those who, in their search for money and power, are ruthless and deceitful. They are patriotic in time of war because it is in their interest to be so. But in time of peace, they follow power and the dollar wherever they may lead. This is an old song.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back. I've got a few more rants, but I'll also pick up your Twitter comments and respond to them as best I can on the air and Facebook and YouTube and stuff. We'll be back.
this a fascinating piece in The Guardian. What if nature, like corporations, had the rights of a person? And without going through the whole argument, the Te Uruwera Act is a law that was passed in New Zealand back in 2014, 2 years ago, and it extended to a 821 square mile forest the legal rights of personhood. The forest is sacred to the Tuho people, an indigenous group of the Maori, and for them, Te Tura was an ancient and ancestral homeland that breathes life into their culture. The forest is also to them a living ancestor. And this act concludes that Te Uruwera has an identity in and of itself, and thus must be its own identity with all the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a legal person. Te Uruwera holds title to itself. Now, this is unique to New Zealand. This is brand new, but there are a number of places around the world where Native people, Aboriginal people, Indigenous people believe, and I would say that the Dakota Access Pipeline is an example of this, believe that the land is sacred and is their mother. We came out of the earth. Look at your body. Every single cell in your body is, made in part out of dirt. We are a product of the earth. What was it? Was it John Donne? Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, and the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is earnest, life is real, and the soul is not, and the grave is not its goal. Life, dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul, if I'm remembering my poetry right. And, dust thou art, to dust returnest. There you go, which I think is paraphrasing something from Proverbs. But in any case, the idea that here in the United States, what we have done, and this is like the absolute pinnacle of Cartesian thinking, right? Of the world as a dead machine thinking that Rene Descartes brought us back in the 1700s, or the 17th century, excuse me. The pinnacle of that kind of thinking is that something that is not alive, that's a human-made abstraction, a corporation, has the rights of personhood. And they do. The Supreme Court has said this over and over and over again. Corporations are people. Mitt Romney, corporations are people, my friend. But nature is not. Nature, which is alive, does not have the right of personhood. Cannot sue or be sued. Doesn't have, any legal rights other than this one 800 square mile forest in New Zealand, which is, like I said, brand new and expect more to come. So how different would our world be? How different would our country be if before an oil company could go in and rip up the land and inject poisonous water underground to frack out things, if they had to recognize the personhood of that land, the sacredness of that land? How different would it be if the lumber companies, before they clear-cut a forest, had to consider all the living things in that forest? And the forest itself is a living organism. How different would it be if nature could have an attorney ad litem the same way that kids in foster care do, or for that matter, just an attorney the same way corporations who are people do, or who are persons, not people? I think this is a great and important idea, so I wanted to share it with you.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeets.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. on the web at aidenmarkets.com. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Program brought to you, by the way, by Cameron Hughes Wines, chwine.com/Tom, Thom. Okay, some comments. I've got comments from all over the place here. And in the next hour, by the way, I'll continue to take your comments on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And I'm going to. I've got a rather lengthy rant to start out the show with in the first hour. So anyhow, let's start with YouTube. Our YouTube comments, prosperity mission. Tom is so on point. As a baby boomer, student of economics, politics, and technology, I've closely observed and lived the shift from government for people and planet to government for corporate interest. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well said. Liberty 56 says, U.S. should set up Nuremberg type trial for all the war criminals. I've been saying that since 2003. I agreed. Well said. Jabberwocky writes, fascists competing to own America. Sounds about right. Remember that they just want the property, not the people. Always bear that in mind. Yes. And Gene Jabberwocky says, I am suspicious of the government wanting to get rid of immigrants. They work hard, dirt cheap, have no rights, and can easily be exploited. Why do they want them out? It's all a show. Yes, it is, actually, and that's going to be the essence of my next hour of my rant, my next hour. But just to respond to you directly, Trump doesn't really care about the lack of immigrant labor in the United States or the presence of immigrant labor in the United States, legal or illegal. Obviously, he just imported, I believe, 74 people, white Europeans, but 74 immigrants into Florida to work at Mar-a-Lago because it's fashionable and fancy to have white guys with thick European accents serving your food and fixing your bed and showing you to your room and carrying your suitcase and giving you the massage, right? And walking around the golf course with you. Trump employs immigrant labor at Mar-a-Lago and no doubt in his other properties. Now, he does it through the visa program that lets you bring in a very small number of people, but, it's not that he cares about American workers. He's not hiring Americans at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, he probably has some, but, he's hiring immigrants at Mar-a-Lago. So why is he so upset about immigrants who are working in meatpacking plants? Because their skin color is brown. It's really that simple. That's the beginning and end of it. The reason that Reagan stopped enforcing employer sanctions, the laws against this stuff in '86, was because the Main Street, so-called Main Street Republicans, the Chamber of Commerce Republicans, they want undocumented labor. They want to be able to lower their labor costs. It's very straightforward stuff. So, but the equation that Roger Stone did this with the Nixon campaign and the Reagan campaign. Paul Manafort did this with the Reagan campaign, the Jerry Ford campaign, and George Herbert Walker Bush campaign. Paul Manafort, the mastermind, him and his partner Lee Atwater, behind the Willie Horton ads. These guys have been doing this for most of my lifetime, using the racial fear of white people to scare those white people into voting for Republicans. That's what's going on. And that's why Trump talks about animals and MS-13 and, these are all just code words for brown people. They don't look like you and me, he's saying to the white Americans. And that's why he's going, those NFL players, they don't respect the flag, they're not patriots, they don't love America, they shouldn't even be in this country. He's not talking about football players, he's talking about black people by and large, African Americans. Let's be honest about this. And I think, Gene Jabberwocky nails it on YouTube. Let me see here. That's our YouTube comments. Well, maybe I got some more here. This is 100 Perdio Robert. He says, I tend to think that most of the envy resides in those who are already wealthy and jealous of those who do more who are more so. That would be like Donald Trump. He's only worth $1 billion. So he's really upset he wants with these people who are worth $10 billion. Anyhow, Robert writes, I think anyone wanting $1 billion is simply criminally insane. Well, I mean, geez, I'd like to have $1 billion. Wouldn't you? But I'm not willing to destroy people's lives for it. I'm not willing to harm my country for it. I'm not willing to ruin the fundamentals of democracy for it. I'm not willing to destroy the planet for it. I'm not willing to refine oil or sell tobacco for it. 1955 Chevy says, my cable company forced me to bundle everything, and they were the only company in the area that's allowed to provide me with internet. On my Twitter feed here, was it Obi? I have to scroll down. Somebody had said, well, why don't you just get copper from Comcast and, go back to old-fashioned POTS lines, plain old telephone service lines. Well, Comcast doesn't provide that, and the only other provider in our area is CenturyLink, and we called them, and they said, nope, you got to bundle it with your internet, just like Comcast. No difference. It's VoIP. It's VoIP. Nobody does copper lines anymore. There you go. So anyhow, a few more comments, but we'll get into a whole nother rant right after the top of the hour. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by XChair, the XChair office chair. XChairTom.com is the website, XChairTHOM.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeats.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Today we're reading in Thom Hartmann University Book Club from How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, Time-Tested Methods for Conquering Worry by Dale Carnegie, perhaps an appropriate book in the era of Trump. This is from Chapter 2, a magic formula for solving worry situations. Would you like a quick, surefire recipe for handling worry situations? A technique you can start using right away before you go any further in reading this book? Then let me tell you about the method worked out by Willis H. Carrier, the brilliant engineer who launched the air conditioning industry and who headed the world-famous Carrier Corporation out of Syracuse, New York. It is one of the best techniques I've ever heard of for solving worry problems, and I got it from Mr. Carrier personally when we were having lunch together one day at the Engineers Club in New York. When I was a young man, Mr. Carrier said, I worked for the Buffalo Forge Company in Buffalo, New York. I was handed the assignment of installing a gas cleaning device in the plant of the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company at Crystal City, Missouri, a plant costing millions of dollars. The purpose of this installation was to remove the impurities from the gas so it could be burned without injuring the engines. This method of cleaning gas was new. It had been tried only once before and under different conditions. In my work at Crystal City, Missouri, unforeseen difficulties arose. It worked after a fashion, but not well enough to meet the guarantee we had made. I was stunned by my failure. It was almost as if someone had struck me a blow on the head. My stomach, my insides began to twist and turn. For a while, I was so worried I couldn't sleep. Finally, common sense reminded me that worry wasn't getting me anywhere. So I figured out a way to handle my problem without worrying. It worked superbly. I've been using the same anti-worry technique for more than 30 years. It is simple. Anyone can use it. It consists of 3 steps. Step 1. I analyzed the situation fearlessly and honestly and figured out what was the worst that could possibly happen as a result of this failure. No one was going to jail me or shoot me, that was certain. True, there was also a chance that I could lose my job, and there was also a chance that my employers would have to remove the machinery and lose the $20,000 we had invested. Step 2. After figuring out what was the worst that could possibly happen, I reconciled myself to accepting it, if necessary. I said to myself, this failure will be a blow to my record and it might possibly mean the loss of my job. But if it does, I can always get another position. Conditions could be much worse, and as far as my employers are concerned, well, they realize that we're experimenting with a new method of cleaning gas, and if this experience costs them $20,000, they can stand it. They can charge it up to research, for it is an experiment. After discovering the worst that could possibly happen and reconciling myself to accepting it, if necessary, an extremely important thing happened. I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in days. Step 3. From that time on, I calmly devoted my time and energy to trying to improve upon the worst which I had already accepted mentally. I now tried to figure out ways and means by which I might reduce the loss of $20,000 that we faced. I made several steps and finally figured out that if we spent another $5,000 for additional equipment, our problem would be solved. We did this, and instead of the firm losing $20,000, we made $15,000. I probably would never have been able to do this if I had kept on worrying, because one of the worst features about worrying is that it destroys the mind's ability to concentrate. When we worry, our minds jump here and there and everywhere, and we lose all power of decision. However, when we force ourselves to face the worst and accept it mentally, we then eliminate all these vague imaginings and put ourselves in a position where we are able to concentrate on our problem in the here and now. This incident that I have related occurred many years ago. It worked so superbly that I've been using it ever since, and as a result, my life has been almost completely free from worry. End of quote. Now, why is Willis H. Carrier's magic formula so valuable and so practical, psychologically speaking? Because it yanks us down out of the great gray clouds in which we fumble around when we are blinded by worry. It plants our feet good and solid on the earth. We know where we stand, and if we can't have solid ground under us, how in creation can we ever hope to think anything through? Professor William James, the father of applied psychology, has been dead since 1910, but if he were alive today and could hear this formula for facing the worst, he would heartily approve. How do I know? Because he told his own students, quote, "Be willing to have it so. Be willing to have it so," he said, because acceptance of what has happened is the first step in overcoming the consequences of any misfortune, end quote. The same idea is expressed by Lin Yutang in his widely read book, The Importance of Living. True peace of mind, says this Chinese philosopher, comes from accepting the worst. Psychologically, I think it means the release of energy. That's it exactly. Psychologically, it means a new release of energy. When we have accepted the worst, we have nothing more to lose. And that automatically means we have everything to gain. After facing the worst, Willis H. Carrier reported, I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in days. From that time on, I was able to think. Makes sense, doesn't it? Yet millions of people have wrecked their lives in angry turmoil because they refused to accept the worst, refused to improve upon it, refused to salvage what they could from the wreck. Instead of trying to reconstruct their fortunes, they engaged in a bitter and violent contest of experience and ended up victims of that brooding fixation known as melancholia. Would you like to see how someone else adopted Willis H. Carrier's magic formula and applied it to his own problem? Well, here's one example from a New York oil dealer who was a student in my classes. I was being blackmailed, the student began. I didn't believe it was possible. I didn't believe it could happen outside the movies, but I was actually being blackmailed. And, you know, he goes on with the story. It's a fascinating one. How to Stop Worrying and Start Living by Dale Carnegie.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And on the line with us, I believe, is Mike Lux. We have Mike's, right? Okay, cool. He is a partner in Democracy Partners. He is the author of 2 books, The Progressive Revolution, and a brand new book out just this week, How to Democrat in the Age of Trump. DemocracyPartners.com is his website. Progressive Lux, L-U-X, is his Twitter handle. Mike, welcome back to the program.
Great to be
Mike?
here. It's been a while. How you doing?
It has been, and thank you for joining us. So tell us about your book, How to Democrat in the Age of Trump. How do you do that? How do I do that? How do we do that?
Well, first of all, on the title, we believe Democrat ought to be a verb. We believe that Democrats need to be in action, need to be doing things, need to be moving.
They need to be democrating to turn it into a gerund.
So we're turning it into a verb. The idea of the book is this, Tom. Democrats have blown it in the last 10 years. The table was set for us in 2008. We just won 2 big elections. The country knew that Republican trickle-down policies sucked, and we could have done so much more. And the fact that we didn't, I think, has turned the tables. All the demographic trends that were going our way are still going our way. The fact that people agreed with us on most issues. Over the last 10 years, we haven't won elections in spite of all those things. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason is that we are not delivering for our own constituents, and we're also not talking to people in a way that deals with people honestly. I mean, my biggest single piece of advice to Democrats is you have to be direct with the American voters. You have to take on the tough issues and talk openly about what's going on in this country right now. You have to talk openly and address issues of race and class and economics. And the fact that we're avoiding tough issues is killing us in the polls.
Well, one of our YouTube commenters, James Vickers, was commenting about some of the corporate media that portrays itself as being left-leaning. And he says, artificial left, not really left, except on gays, guns, and abortion, and maybe immigration. But the genuine left issues that FDR really created as the foundation of the Democratic Party, worker, pay, distribution of income, you never hear discussion of those things in corporate-owned media. And by the way, we had, Mark Pocan comes on this program every week for an hour and takes phone calls. You know, he's the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, representative from Wisconsin.
Mark was at my party last night.
And he has pitched himself and other members of the Progressive Caucus literally hundreds of times to the networks to come on and talk about these economic issues, these pocketbook issues, these fairness issues. Is it right that billionaires are getting richer when working people are actually behind the debt of millennials, free college education for everybody, Medicare for all, and literally the networks will not book Democrats on those topics. They are only willing to book Democrats by and large right now if they're willing to talk about Donald Trump or about Russia.
Yeah, I think that's right. The media is a huge part of the problem. I think that Democrats, because they're desperate for the media, they allow themselves to get played sometimes. But there's no question that the corporate-owned media is a big part of the problem. I think we need to, and Tom, you and I have discussed this for years, I think we need to take advantage of our own progressive media. We need to go online. We need to go person to person online. We need to use all of the kind of progressive media that we can to get our message out. And I also think candidates need to be very clear and very strong in this environment to talk about the issues that really matter. Classic example: Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. They break through when they talk about economic issues because they're clear about what they're saying. They say it in strong, decisive, bold language, and so when they talk about it, the media almost has to listen. They also are able to create their own media in a sense. Bernie's Facebook page, Elizabeth's Facebook page, and working with Facebook pages and other media outlets like Act TV and Attention, your show. That's how we get our message out, and I think we can get our message out by using those media. And we also just have to keep all of us have to keep holding corporate media accountable.
Yeah, I don't think holding them accountable is something that's even possible any longer. I think that it's time for the Sherman Act, but that's a whole nother conversation.
I do agree with you on that, and my book talks a lot actually about antitrust and Sherman Act related issues. Monopoly is such a huge problem in this country, and I think if Democrats get power again, that's one of the very first things that we ought to be doing is taking on the monopolies.
And Schumer was waving that flag for a while a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know if some of his big donors came along and said, or if he's just kind of waiting for the opportunity, because Chuck Schumer can be very progressive, or sometimes he's not, But I'm kind of, I don't dislike Chuck Schumer at all. The guy knows how to play politics and knows how to play hardball on the one hand, and has given some extraordinarily progressive speeches. On the other hand, I have not seen him taking names and kicking ass the way that I think the Democrats need to be doing. And it's not just him. And maybe he is, and the media is simply not reporting it. Because that's what I'm hearing, from Pocan and from Keith Ellison and others who have sincerely tried to break through the media filter. But the media, they're perfectly willing to allow Democrats to portray themselves as the party that is concerned about the rights of black people. In fact, they're enthusiastic about that. They're perfectly willing to allow Democrats to portray themselves as the party that are concerned about the rights of gay people and trans people. In fact, they're enthusiastic about that. They're perfectly willing to allow Democrats to portray themselves as the party that cares about immigrants. In fact, they're enthusiastic about that. Because all those things cost nobody anything in terms of their advertisers and the corporations themselves. And all those things are being weaponized against Democrats by Republicans. But they will not allow Democrats to come on and talk about the minimum wage. They will not allow Democrats to come on and talk about executive pay, particularly in this era when the media are just as bad as anybody else in terms of executive pay. They will not allow Democrats to come on and talk about the horrors that are being done against unions. They will not allow Democrats to come on and talk about these a minimum wage, a guaranteed basic income, government as employer of last resort. These are real big issues that historically have hugely won elections for Democrats, to the point that in 1954, Dwight Eisenhower wrote a letter to his brother Edgar in which he said that should any political party say that they are going to do away with Social Security and unemployment insurance and farm programs and things like that, and there's basically wage protections and unions, should any party ever say that, they will never be heard from again. And he says, I know there's a small number of oil men in Texas, the Hunt brothers come to mind, who think that this is possible, but their numbers are small and they're stupid. That was because back in the 50s, if somebody had come along and said that, it would have made the news. But now it's like, the Democrats are being portrayed as the party of affiliation with basically minorities. And the Republicans are being portrayed as the party that represents everybody else, particularly the white majority. And it's really not the case. The Democrats economically have always represented everybody to a large extent. You shouldn't say always, certainly since the 60s. And well, arguably since the 30s, although, if you bring race into this, since the 60s. But the average American doesn't know that because that's not what they're hearing from their media.
Well, I of course think you're right, Tom. I do think we need to sharpen our own message on economics. I think we allow ourselves to get pulled off sometimes into some of those other issues. But if you look at the way, I mean, this is obviously it's not a presidential year, so it's a different kind of dynamic. If you look at the way local races are being run, more and more Democrats are doing a good job of running on economic issues at the local level.
You're right.
And forcing the conversation at the local level, which is why, by the way, I think we've been doing better in local elections. We just won another big special election last night in Missouri. We're winning special elections across the country, and
especially when genuine progressives run, as opposed to kind of middle of the road, squishy, who knows what you really believe kind of Democrats.
Well, exactly, and especially the ones who do talk about the kind of economic issues that you're talking about. I think in 2020, when it gets to 2020, we will have a Democratic debate, a primary debate. It's going to be the most wide open primary in a very long time. We're going to have a lot of candidates. They're going to have a chance to lay out an agenda. And in my book, I talk about what I think that agenda ought to be. It won't shock you, Tom, at all to know that I think it's got to be mostly framed around economics. And I think you even frame issues that some people refer to me in a ridiculous kind of way as identity politics. You frame those issues around economics as well. Criminal justice reform. You don't think that, if anyone thinks that the for-profit prison industry isn't the driver behind the terrible criminal justice system we have in this country, they're smoking something.
Well, but here's another one. The Kochs and others are promoting this mens rea thing, where they say, yeah, sure, we'll let some people out of prison. You got to change the law though, so that when corporate CEOs make decisions that cause people to die, if you can't prove that they intended to kill those people, you can't put the CEOs in jail anymore. And that mens rea stuff has been built into every one of these bills that even Democrats are for. I'm not even sure that they're aware it's there because the media won't talk about it.
Well, I will tell you that this actually came up a couple years ago when everybody on both sides of the aisle was pushing criminal justice reform. And I will say something positive about my Democratic friends.
Very quick, please.
The reason that it died is because Democrats in the Senate stopped it because of that provision.
Because of the mens rea. Good. Mike Lux, democracypartners.com. Progressive Lux is his Twitter handle. The new book is How to Democrat in the Age of Trump. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Tom. It's been great to be on.
Thom Hartmann Program.
Back at you. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your Twitter feeds and YouTube comments and Facebook comments right after this. And Bar. Hey, Steve, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, thanks for taking my call. Last night, Bernie Sanders was on Rachel Maddow, and he did something and said something which I really appreciated, and that was a kind of talked about strategy, and that the resistance is really important. It's a critical part of the strategy, but it comes with also continuing to push progressive agenda because that's what the country wants. So we have to resist Donald Trump and push for $15 an hour and push for free college tuition and push for expanding Social Security, not just preserving it. And all of these things have to happen at the same time, which makes our job that much more difficult. But I really appreciated hearing that the party and the left has to be more than just being opposed to Trump. They actually have to be for progressive agendas, and that I just wanted to share that with you, and I really
and that's what people want. Steve, in 1981, one of the advisors to I think it was Lee Atwater, one of the advisors to Ronald Reagan, I may be wrong on exactly who it was, but I'm pretty sure it was Lee Atwater, came up with this idea of what he referred to as the perpetual campaign. Kevin Phillips, I think, later wrote a book about this. And basically was every single day that goes by should be an opportunity to get some press that will cause more people, more kind of undecided people or low information people to think you're doing a great job, your party's doing a great job, and the next election comes, I really should vote for you. And Reagan was the first presidency where we saw this continual, perpetual campaign. He campaigned or he or his surrogates literally every day of the 8 years that he was president. And that was not something that was picked up by Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton didn't have to do it methodically because he was such a brilliant politician himself. He was always down on the Hill, glad-handing people and talking to the press and stuff. And of course, it would have been very difficult given all the impeachment hearings and whatnot. But basically, every Republican has done this, and the Obama administration did not even remotely consider doing something like this. They have done the opposite of this. They've basically kind of said, we're governing things. We've got this. Chill out. Don't worry. We got this under control. And that, obviously has not worked well. And I didn't see Bernie on Rachel last night because I was in bed by then. But I have read the articles about it. I saw a clip of it this morning. And it looks to me like what Bernie is proposing is that Democrats start doing what Republicans figured out works in 1980.
Can I add one more thing?
Please.
I think when people are saying we want leadership that fights, to me what that means is we may not have the votes necessarily to win, but we'll still push legislation that pushes progressive agendas. So we may not have the votes to get like $15 an hour on the federal level, but if we still push it and Republicans vote it down, or if we still push for free college tuition and Republicans vote it down, at least we're fighting for the things that we believe in.
Yep.
And I know that's something I would appreciate, and I think most of the country would appreciate it too, because most of the country, I think across the political aisle, still wants these progressive agendas.
We are, we're a progressive country. There's just no doubt about that. There's, any poll will tell you that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Steve, thank you for the call, and thanks for watching Free Speech TV. We'll be back in and thanks for the great observation, by the way, Steve. I really think that this is the key to the whole thing. Is now for the next, now I was going to say for the next 4 years, maybe now forever, the Democrats, progressive Democrats, need to get up and get out there, get organized and get out there every single day with their message.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeats.com. The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Welcome back. Harrys.com code TOM is our sponsor, our underwriter for this hour. And I wanted to, by the way, I just, because of this Comcast outage, it's like this is happening all over the country. I just looked up here, Epping, New Hampshire. The headline, this is Kirk Enstrom. It's the local newspaper, apparently. No, it's WMUR. I'm not sure if that's a radio station or a television station. I'm guessing it's the local TV station in Epping, New Hampshire. Phone lines were down Wednesday at the Epping Police Department and the Kingston Fire Department because of an outage affecting Comcast customers across the country. Amazing. I mean, this is, you can't call a fire department, you can't call the police department. This is what happens when you have giant monopolies rather than competition. I'm not saying that the failure of a system is the fault of giant monopolies. I mean, Comcast has as much right to offer telephone service as anybody in the country. But the fact that lobbyists for big telecom companies have lobbied Congress to change the laws so that, unlike, you know, if you're old enough to remember the era of, say, for example, CompuServe and AOL and dial-up modems, you would get on your phone line with your computer and you would dial up CompuServe or AOL and you'd get your internet through them. Or you could get it from SovereignNet, or you could get it from Spirit One, or you can get it from, I mean, there are literally thousands of internet service providers in the United States. Around 2000, around the year 2000, I personally have I know two different people who were starting ISPs, internet service provider companies. They were starting companies to provide internet services to people, because anybody could use any ISP. Well, that's just not the case any longer. And as long as we've got this monopoly situation, what would otherwise be small problems, if we had thousands of phone companies across the United States, you wouldn't have fire departments from the West Coast to the East Coast losing their ability to get a phone call. Again, I got no problem with Comcast offering phone services or internet services or anything else. But there should be competition. This is, somebody tweeted me, hate the game, not the player. Spot on. I mean, I'm very disappointed by the quality of service Comcast has provided us in general, because we're constantly going down here. But more broadly speaking, I'm far more horrified by the fact that nobody is allowed to compete with them by law. That's wrong.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We need to change the game, and this should be something Democrats are talking about, and this would be a great example for it. I mean, great moment, something, news story to grab onto. Thom Hartmann University Book Club today. We're reading from It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America by David K. Johnston. This is from page 61, the chapter titled Forgetting the Forgotten Man. In 2010, the U.S. Department of Labor created a website to honor workers who died on the job. Quote, more than 4,500 workers, lose their lives on the job every year. Below are the names of just a few who have died in recent months. OSHA's mission is to prevent workplace injuries, illnesses, and death, end quote. That Occupational Safety and Health Administration webpage was intended to highlight and humanize workplace deaths, to ensure awareness of tragedies, especially those that could have been avoided, according to Jordan Barab, an Assistant Secretary of Labor during the Obama administration. Barab explained, without information like this, fatality statistics are just raw, sterile numbers. The purpose of adding names and circumstances was to impress people with the tragedy that workers and their families face day after day. In August 2017, Trump's Labor Department quietly removed the preamble and the names when it killed the web page. It also took down, without public announcement, the fatality inspection data for all years prior to 2017. Those were just two of many other Trump administration actions inimical to worker safety. Others included no longer posting press releases about deaths resulting from unsafe working conditions, delaying rules to reduce sickness and death from inhaling silica and beryllium at work, delaying rules to lower the risk of railroad engineers and truck drivers falling asleep at the switch or wheel because of untreated sleep apnea, and the appointment to the Supreme Court of a judge who held that a company had the right to fire a worker who chose not to freeze to death on the job. A reasonable person listening to Donald Trump's inaugural address would never have expected these and other actions, assuming he believed what Trump said. Trump declared, "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no more. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens," end quote. Those men and women were forgotten again the following week. And it's not just workers whose interests were forgotten, not to mention who were put in danger. By deciding not to implement a rule to reduce the chances of truck drivers and train operators falling asleep at the wheel, Trump put at risk the lives of families driving along the highway, people riding on passenger trains, and many others. The White House called it President Trump's war on regulation. In his weekly radio address in early May, he declared that we've removed one job-killing regulation after another, and they're not pretty, and they're going. And believe me, we're just getting started on regulations. They're gone. Removal of data on workplace deaths, which averaged 13 per day, infuriated Jordan Barab, who was Obama's number 2 at OSHA. As a private citizen, Barab created a web page to keep track of the names of the dead and the reasons they were killed on the job. He called it, "OSHA won't tell you who died in the workplace, we will." After the election, Barab's concerns that the Trump administration would be bad for workers increased when he asked where the Trump beachhead team was and learned that none was coming. Each incoming administrator sends people to scope out federal agencies, learn who does what, and get a feel for the place in advance. Then the incoming administration sends its landing team, the people who will initially implement its policies for each agenda or at each agency. When no beachhead team came up, Barab figured it meant worker safety simply was not a priority for Trump. He hoped that was the worst of it, nothing more than apathy about worker safety. But when the landing team arrived, Barab realized trouble was coming for American workers, and it was not official apathy, but the start of assaults on workers' rights and safety. Barab said most of them had no idea they were going to labor and no interest in workers' issues either. What they did have was a mandate to delay, repeal, or weaken regulations that protected workers as part of Trump's plan to eliminate, quote, any regulation that is outdated, unnecessary, bad for workers, or contrary to the national interest, end quote. The first sign came when Trump nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Gorsuch was an acolyte of Antonin Scalia, whose seat he would be taking. Like Scalia, he said statutes should be literally read, and if that made no sense, well, that was a problem for Congress. Also like Scalia, he had a habit of consulting dictionaries, often following Scalia's practice of relying on the third, fourth, or even lesser definition of a word when it supported his jurisprudence. Trump's nomination alarmed unions. Jody Calamine, a communications worker of America lawyer, told Gorsuch's Senate confirmation hearing that Gorsuch, quote, is a threat to working people's health and safety, end quote. Calamine cited Gorsuch's dissent in the 2016 case to make his point. That dissent, he said, reveals an anti-worker bias and features the judicial activism that will ultimately put workers' lives at risk, end quote. Those are unusually strong words about a Supreme Court nominee, but a review of the case shows Gorsuch has little regard for human life, at least when it comes to employers' power over their workers. He considers a rigid interpretation of the law more important. The case was about a law Congress passed giving workers the right to refuse dangerous tasks. Gorsuch said, no, you may not refuse. It's even worse than you think, by David K. Johnston. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And I want to get back to this original, this is going to be my second hour rant. This is, Jeff Merkley has sent out I'm on Jeff Merkley's email list. Presumably I've contributed to him in the past. I'm quite sure I have. I donate to a few Democrats. And so anyhow, I get this email from Jeff Merkley, who was on our program yesterday, as I recall, wasn't it? Yesterday, Sean, yeah. Talking about this exact same thing. He says, Thomas, yeah, so it must be from a donation, because that's the name on my credit card. Anyhow, last weekend I visited a Brownsville, Texas warehouse that reportedly has 1,000 children locked inside. I wasn't allowed to enter. No member of Congress has been inside. Donald Trump has implemented a horrific child snatching policy. He has instructed immigration agents to rip children from the arms of their parents. These are families who are fleeing to America because their lives are at risk at home. That's, by the way, one of the most important things that is almost never clearly explained on television. I would be willing to bet that 99% of Americans believe that what's happening is Mom and Dad and little Miguel are just waded across the Rio Grande and got busted by ICE agents as they were trying to sneak into Brownsville, Texas, or whatever it is, wherever it is, whatever's on the border there. That's not what is the majority of this. The majority of these are families or mothers and children who are presenting themselves to the Immigration and Customs Service. They're showing up. They are going to border crossings and border stations and saying, we are applying for asylum. Other members of our family were murdered in Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, or Mexico. We are fleeing violence. And under the United Nations treaties and the laws of the United States, we are required to allow people seeking asylum into our country at least long enough to determine if their request for asylum is legitimate, and if so, to provide them with that asylum. We are required to do that. These are people fleeing violence. They're not people trying to get a job at a gardening shop. And when they present themselves as refugees looking for asylum, the children are literally torn from their parents' arms. Back to Jeff Merkley's letter. These are families who are fleeing to America because their lives are at risk at home. I'm trying to shine a spotlight on this cruel, horrific policy. This policy is 100% unacceptable. It's morally bankrupt. It is inconsistent with any religious tradition anywhere. In fact, if you go to Matthew 25, for all the God-fearing Christians out there who call themselves Republicans, and I say are just BS artists, you go to Matthew 25 and you go through the list of the things that Jesus was saying will get you into heaven or get you sent to hell for not doing. And it was feed the hungry, heal the sick, visit those in prison. And I think in Matthew 25, now I don't have it in front of me, but it was welcome the stranger. Now maybe that's not in Matthew 25, maybe that's, in the Beatitudes or someplace else. But anyhow, Christianity does not preach purging asylum seekers. Jeff Merkley goes on to point out the White House has responded by launching a smear campaign against me because their policy is indefensible, and that's true. The Trumpettes are, oh my God, there's Trump on MSNBC again. Hang on just a second, I got to change the channel. The Trumpettes are totally, they've just totally gone off the top of saying that Merkley and other Democrats are in favor of, quote, open borders. Excuse me? The only political group in America that is in favor of open borders are libertarians. Libertarians, as part of their core philosophical beliefs, do not believe that the borders of countries should restrict the flow of goods, money, or people. The European Union is a giant libertarian experiment, which is why it's failing. I don't know of a single Democrat, and I don't think I've ever known a single Democrat who believes in, quote, open borders. It's the libertarians, and most libertarians vote Republican. The Koch brothers are libertarians, or at least were. David Koch ran for vice president of the United States on the libertarian ticket. So the Trump administration, Donald Trump lies for fun and profit, and this is the profit part of it. Trump administration is just saying, Jeff Merkley just wants open borders, and he likes MS-13 or whatever. No, that's not what's going on at all. It's a flat-out lie. And just to show how much things have changed in this country, it used to be in America that when employers hired people who were not citizens, there were consequences. Now, this used to be a big deal. It used to be a quick ticket to jail, or huge fines and penalties, or having your business just shut down permanently. For example, January of 1993, the first weeks of the brand new Bill Clinton administration. And one of the things that Bill Clinton had promised when he was running for president was that he wanted, if he became president, he was going to have a cabinet that was representative of the American people. It would be half women, half men, ideally, if he could get there. It would be 15 or 20% minorities. It would be representative of America. And so his first choice for Attorney General of the United States, Chief Law Enforcement Officer, the job that Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III now holds, America's most racist Keebler elf. His nomination for that job, I shouldn't say that because it kind of diminishes the office, and the AG's office is a big deal. I mean, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for the country. He nominated a corporate lawyer by the name of Zoe Baird. Zoe Baird was competent, professional. She was doing very well. She was making $500,000 a year as a corporate lawyer. Her husband was making $600,000 a year. I mean, between the two of them, they were making over $1 million a year. This was a power couple, right? And these people were like well thought of. And Bill Clinton said, let's make you the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States. And when the hearings began, the Republicans who had did their opposition research and staked out Zoe Baird's house and discovered that she had two people working in her home, and I believe they were living in the home as well. It's been a lot of years since '93. I don't frankly remember, but I believe they were living there as well. They were from Peru. It was a couple. One was the nanny, the other was the chauffeur for their child. Zoe Baird and her husband had a under 10-year-old young child. And these two people from Peru were here without documentation. And the Republicans started howling about that in the United States Senate. And the media picked it up, and the media started going after it. The Republicans called it Nannygate. This was the first scandal in quotes, the first phony baloney. I mean, well, it was a real crime that she committed, actually hiring these people. But this was the first effort by the Republicans to hamstring the brand new Clinton presidency. He had been in office fewer than 2 weeks when this happened. And she had to step down. And then the next month, there was an opening for a federal judge. And this was back in the days when the Republicans, they didn't control the Senate, so they couldn't stop. I don't believe they controlled the Senate, so they couldn't stop the appointment of federal judges during a Democratic presidency. Or if they did, they weren't doing that. And so Clinton was allowed to make a nomination, and the Senate was actually going to deal with it. And so here we are 6 weeks into the Clinton presidency in 1993. This is in February. And he nominates a woman named Kimba Wood. Those of you old enough to remember these stories are recognizing these names. Remember what Kimba Wood had done? She had also hired a nanny who was not a U.S. citizen. And so her gig as a federal judge ended the day before it started. I mention all this because today 114 people were arrested earlier this morning, or maybe late yesterday afternoon, by over 200 ICE agents in Sandusky, Ohio, at a gardening and landscaping shop. The immigrants who were arrested, the 114 immigrants who were arrested, are all facing criminal charges, including identity theft and tax evasion, because they're using phony Social Security numbers in order to get paid. But the landscaping company, it's called Corso's. This is John Minchillo and Elliot Spaggett writing at TalkingPointsMemo.com. No criminal charges have been filed against Corso's, although the employer is under investigation, authorities said. In April, they note agents made about 100 worker arrests at a meatpacking plant in rural Tennessee. Another high-profile show of force. Once again, no criminal charges have been filed against the employer. So we have shifted from a paradigm where employers who hired people who were here without documentation, illegally hired people. See, the crime is hiring them. Employers who had hired people went to jail or lost their jobs or didn't qualify to become federal judges or attorneys general. But the immigrants themselves, they just, you know, Kimba Wood and Zoe Baird, they just had to fire the people that were working for them. Sorry, I can't hire you anymore. And, you know, if they couldn't get a job anywhere, they probably left the country. We have gone from that to scapegoating people who came looking for employment that was being offered to them by largely wealthy white people like Zoe Baird. Not to particularly trash Zoe Baird, but you get my point. And Donald Trump is now turning that into a giant template, or not template, what do you call the word? For race, you know, a stand-in for race. He's talking about animals and MS-13 and all this kind of stuff. And what he's really saying in code is brown people. The same way that when George Herbert Walker Bush, when Paul Manafort was running his campaign, and along with Lee Atwater, and they were running the Willie Horton ads, and George Herbert Walker Bush was talking about, we need law and order in the United States. He was really talking about, we need to step on black people. As was Donald Trump when he ran a full-page ad calling for the death penalty for the Central Park Five, who, by the way, were exonerated with DNA. They didn't do it. But don't tell that to Donald Trump. So anyhow, that's where we're at. We don't have an illegal immigration problem in the United States. We have an illegal employer problem. On this, Mitt Romney was right. Mitt Romney, he was ridiculed for it by Republicans. But he said, you know, go after the employers. People will stop coming to the country.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And then Romney made the fatal mistake of saying, and then those people will self-deport. And they all laughed at him. But history shows that it's actually true. Keep in mind, Donald Trump is basing most of his campaign on the fact that wages have been stagnant for 35 years. And he's saying it's because of Mexico. It's because of China. It's because of our trade deals. Well, to some extent it is, but it's also, and in fact, according to these guys at the Economic Policy Institute, largely because of the loss of unions in the United States, which is, you know, the cornerstone of Reaganism. Destroy the unions, you destroy the funding mechanism for the Democratic Party, and they'll have to start getting in bed with banksters, which is exactly what happened. So anyhow, and so you would think that, you know, if Trump really wants to restore the American dream and bring back the American prosperity we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that he would be saying, hey, we need to go back to 35% unionization instead of the 6 or 7% we have right now in the private sector. Of course, he's not talking like that because he's a Republican. I mean, you just heard Harry Truman on this. So here are the key findings of the report. 1, for non-union private sector men, weekly wages would be an estimated 5% higher in 2013. This is the last year that they had numbers for that they could really crunch well. But it's, you know, you can extrapolate it to today. For non-union private sector men, weekly wages would be an estimated 5% higher in 2013 if private sector union density remained at its 1979 level.
For a year-round work, in other words, union density, number of people who are union members in the workforce. For a year-round worker, this translates to an annual wage loss of $2,700. For the 40 million non-union private sector men, the loss is equivalent to $2.1 billion fewer dollars in weekly paychecks, which represents an annual wage loss of $109 billion, just slightly more than the net wealth of the Koch brothers. I added. For non-union private sector men without a bachelor's degree or more education, non-college graduates, weekly wages would be an estimated 8% higher in 2013 if union density remained at its 1979 levels. For a year-round worker, this translates into an annual wage loss of over $3,000. And they continue through the list. You know, it's taking out these various slices of people. The degree of non-union wage decline reflects how much unionization has declined since 1979 among private sector men by 2/3, from 34% to 10%. That 10% includes government employees. Among women by more than 1/3, from 16 to 6%. And especially among non-college degree men by more than 2/3, from 38 to 11%. As unions have receded from the private sector, their effect on the wages of non-members percent of unionization has declined. And this is they go through more of the details and all this stuff, but this is something I have been pointing out since we started this program 13 years ago, that for every good union job in an economy, there's always a parallel non-union job that basically has the same wages and benefits because the unions set the floor. And as you destroy the unions, you destroy the floor. And now working people in the United States are basically falling through the floor. Wages have been flat since Reaganomics really took hold in 82, 83, 84. And they've actually declined, in particular for non-college educated men and for women since that time.
Welcome back. Occupying the media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. Thom Hartmann here with you enthusiastically. Okay, some of our comments from YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, that pile I've already done. Here we go. These are from our YouTube chat room. Richard Wood says, Enron was a Republican invention we paid for. That is Republican politics, no responsibility but to false gods. Amen. Oh, speaking of gods, a special shout out to For American Values on Twitter, because I was mentioning the Matthew 25, and it's been probably a year since I've read Matthew 25, and I used to have most of it memorized, and I was pretty sure and I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in, therefore off to hell with you. But American Values, it's Matthew 25:43. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me. Therefore, off you go. Okay, thank you. For American Values on Twitter. Let's see. Malcolm Brown. Bain Capital is still using Mitt Romney's playbook. Did he win Utah's primary for the Senate? I don't know. I would be astonished if he didn't. And I predict that Mitt Romney will be elected to the Senate from Utah in November and will immediately begin campaigning for president and will be, if there is a serious challenge to Donald Trump, it will be Mitt Romney, in my opinion. But we'll see. Time will tell. Let's see. Richard Wood over on YouTube says, consume. Reconciling the fact will be tough on the planet no matter we can do better. Recognizing the population would be a good start in family planning. Yes. Ryan for Prez writes, I fear white people, especially in suits. Those guys can rob you of money you haven't even earned yet. Right. Max Payne says all the people that want to keep out undocumented workers should volunteer to go to Texas and pick watermelons all day when it's 110 degrees and get paid less than minimum wage for working. Well, yes and no. I mean, what should happen is that picking watermelons in the hot sun in Texas should be a job that pays decently. And yeah, if I have to pay an extra 20 cents for a watermelon in the supermarket or even an extra 50 cents, that's not an unreasonable thing. You know, you either have an economy that works for everybody or you don't. You can't have the working poor and immigrants subsidizing the middle class, essentially. Just like it's inappropriate to have the middle class subsidizing the very rich, which of course is what's been going on in a big way since 1981. John McCain actually opened up this can of worms back, geez, I was back here in Portland doing the show, so it must have been 8 or 10 years ago. And McCain made the comment in a press conference, people were asking him questions about immigration, and he made the comment that in Arizona, you know, they grow lettuce in Arizona. And he said, you couldn't find people who, you know, white people, who would come to Arizona to pick lettuce, even if you paid them $50 an hour. And he got like 10,000 job applications. I'm not sure he said white people, but what he meant was, you know, non-Hispanic, non-immigrants, white people, black people, whatever. You get my point, middle-class people. Anyhow, a lot of great comments on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm sorry I didn't have the time to get to all of them. I just got tied up in my rants. We're going to have Lamar on tomorrow if our phone lines are back. And Congressman Pocan will be with us as well. So it should be an interesting and fun day. Thanks so much for being with us today. And please don't ever forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us to participate. And the stakes are really high. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
From UN
The
headquarters
Thom Hartmann
in New
Program
York.
is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by X-Chair, the X-Chair office chair. xchairthom.com is the website, xchairthom.com. Not only are we pleased to have Super Beets as an underwriter for our program, but it's a great product that I drink every day. Check it out at Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com, or give them a call at 800-568-9889. Super Beets.